Hello, this is Matthias Goertz again with my monthly COVID-19 update, to which purpose I will share my screen with you. So welcome. We're gonna go straight in. This is as per 1st of April. It's not a April's Fool's joke. In the year 1 after Homo sapiens, you recall that last time we finally realized that Homo sapiens did not exist. We did not abolish Homo sapiens. We just realized that Homo sapiens had never been sapiens, and therefore it had never existed as Homo sapiens. We are some other Homo, but not sapiens. So we are in a new era, in that for the first time, at least as far as I am concerned personally, maybe you've always known that, but for me that was new, that I realized we are simply not very thoughtful and wise. We are not thinking, we are not using our brain the way we could, and we don't deserve the moniker Homo sapiens. So this is year 1 after Homo sapiens, a new era. You can call it the new normal if you like. I don't like that term, but that's okay. Yeah, and this new image on my front page, yes. Now this girl, or young lady in the middle here, reminded me a little bit of my daughter, and so that was quite shocking actually, because she sits in school every day with a mask on, I don't know how many hours every day, right? So I had to think of that. But this image also reminded me of another image, and I couldn't quite initially put my finger on which image it reminded me of, but eventually I realized. And let me show you that other image that I was reminded of. It's this. This is the book cover, at least the book version I have on my shelf. There are, of course, various versions of this book by Kazuo Ishiguro, Never Let Me Go. It's a, if you like, dystopian novel. This is the image I was reminded of when I saw those school children on the previous page, a photo which is courtesy of the BBC, so I'm grateful to the BBC for that. So this is what I was reminded of. And those of you who don't know this novel, this is about a bunch of teenagers going to a special school. And peu à peu, as you go through the novel, initially they just seem to be like any other teenagers. But as you go through the novel, you more and more realize there's something strange about these children, these young. They're in the course of the novel, they're becoming young adults. So you're going with them through their sort of teenage years. They're in a kind of a boarding school, a little bit in the countryside. And you realize something is strange about them. And finally, it turns out they're not really children at all. They're sources of organs that are harvested. Once they are grown up enough, their organs are starting to be harvested, to be transferred to elderly people with organ failures. Maybe they start with a kidney, of which we have 2, so you can still live happily with only 1 kidney. Then maybe one of the 2 lungs in the second operation, and then the third time, well, it gets tough, right? Because there is no more organs that we have 2 of. So if you transfer a heart or a liver, then then life becomes very short for these young people. So their only reason of existence is to be storage, walking storage of farms of organs to be transplanted. And it's of course written very, very well, and it sort of creeps up on you, and I can't replicate that here. But it does remind me of what we are doing right now with our children. I mean, there are children in the world who have not been inside a school for 1 year now in some countries. And if they are inside school, they wear masks all the time, which is not very conducive to to thinking, I believe. I cannot think at all when I have a mask on, but maybe that's just me. That we are not harvesting their organs yet, but it's not a very big step from making these taking these children hostage on behalf of elderly who may have a problem with their immune system, which almost virtually none of these youngsters have, with very few exceptions, right? So these youngsters, they have no problem with this virus. For them, SARS-CoV-2 is just another common cold virus, as we've discussed. Nevertheless, they are the ones to some degree suffering most from this whole thing. So we are literally taking our own children hostage, and for no reason, because yes, they can spread the virus, that's true. So if you have an ideology of having to hammer down on the virus, then yeah, then you lock everybody up, including your children, yes. But of course, as we've discussed many times, that is a completely nonsensical ideology. Makes absolutely no sense. So we are locking, or at least either locking up or leaving at home, or at least reducing the opportunities for our children to play and do the normal stuff for no reason. There's absolutely no reason to do that. This is purely criminal, what we're doing to our children. And it's our own children. Yeah, so in my view, there's not a very big step from what we're doing now to what Ishiguro is describing in the novel, right? I mean, we've given up on basic rights, we've given up on any kind of protection for the individual. So the sky is the limit, anything goes, right? In a state of exception where the law is suspended, anything goes, right? So let's see what else we will do with our children. I'm curious to see. Quick quote from Roosevelt: "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And for the last 12 months, humanity, or the post-Homo sapiens Homo, has been driven by irrational fear of a common cold virus, and that is the biggest danger. Now, Roosevelt said this in 1933. There was a global depression at that time. There was, the rise of the Nazis in Germany, etc. I mean, there were reasons to be worried about the future. Still, he said, look, we can handle all these things. The only thing we need to avoid is, fear itself, right? Because it will freeze us, right? Today, we're in a different situation because we have actually no problem. There is no problem objectively, right? So it's the fear doesn't even, there's just fear, but the fear doesn't even have an objective basis, as it perhaps did in Roosevelt's day. Right? So, this quote of his still holds, but the situation is different in that we don't even have a problem. Other than, yes, a demographic problem, yeah, we've talked about it, right? So yes, it's a social situation that we've created over many decades and that we need to talk about, yeah. And that will not go away. And yeah, we have to deal with it, yes, but certainly not in the way we have dealt with it in the last 12 months, which was counterproductive and destructive. Okay, now we are in the era of fun, right? Since we are no longer Homo sapiens, we can take it all a bit easier. At least I've decided for myself to not take this whole thing very seriously anymore. I'm still gonna share my updates with you because it's fun, but I don't take this very seriously anymore because it's just past the point where you can still take it seriously. a week ago, I sent a video message to Frau Merkel. I will share the gist of it with you at the end of this presentation. But that is sort of it. That is sort of the end of my sort of seriously trying to, trigger some thinking on the part, at least of the one government that sort of I'm a citizen to, if you like. I'm the sovereign of, or part of the sovereign of that government, right? So I have both a right and a duty to at least try to get that government, the Merkel government, the German government, to to start thinking. But I know it is hopeless. So that was my last attempt, and since about a week ago, I'm just not taking it very seriously anymore. So let me start, therefore, with some good fun, some good. Now this is from Thailand. I have a personal interest in Thailand. My family being half Thai. It's very near to where I am, and yet so far away because it's virtually impossible to go there or to come back without major quarantine repercussions. But let me show you what the Thai government is doing, to get the tourists back. 20% of all jobs in Thailand are supposedly depending on tourism, directly or indirectly, and about 10% or over 10%, maybe 12% of GDP. So this is the industry in Thailand, right? And that's just, but the generals have decided to just destroy it. Basically, they never liked it very much. Frivolous. I used that term before. They think it's frivolous. Right? The only tourism they understand is medical tourism or educational tourism. All that. But sitting on a beach with a beer, the generals don't understand that. That's not what generals do, right? So the Thai government is hoping that the new initiative will bring in 58 million in yacht tourism. So it's a yacht tourism initiative. They basically are allowed to do their quarantine on a yacht. Now, how big do you think is that segment among the 20 million or so visitors that Thailand usually gets in a year? More than 20 million, I think. So they're hoping for $58 million US dollar in revenues. Normally, the tourism sector in Thailand accounts for many billions of dollars. So this is not even a drop in the ocean. Yeah, so they've graduated from quarantine on a golf course. You reckon there are not that many golfers among those tourists to Thailand either? I don't think they outnumber the ones who sit on the beach and have a beer. I don't think so, but yeah. So they you can see what type of tourism the generals like. Golf is okay because they themselves play golf, right? Yachting is okay, that's kosher, and especially if you then off the coast and do your quarantine out there on the water. Now that's very safe. I love this. I mean, this is really creative. However, now here comes a bit of a catch. Travelers are required to wear a smart wristband that monitors vital signs. So they want to make sure you haven't, disappeared, and become a pirate or something, including temperature. Well, imagine you had a raised temperature out there on your little yacht on the ocean. Oh my God! And they wouldn't let you on land to get medical care, right? You better have a big yacht with your own little operating theater in it. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend this scheme to you, right? Blood pressure, yeah, very, very vital. I mean, vital things, yeah. I mean, they have a lot to do with, common cold virus that we're talking about. Blood pressure, I like that. And tracking the various location, yeah. That's sort of by the way, because that's probably the main thing, right? They basically trace you, right? They make sure you're not using your little yacht to go on land somewhere in some quiet, bay or backwater, and oops, get on land without having completed your quarantine, right? So they will be watching you. Big Brother will be watching you. And there's other plans, that people can then undertake the quarantine in certain tourist areas. I mean, they had that scheme last year. If you went into a 5-star luxury hotel for 2 weeks, fully booked, fully paid up upfront, 3-4 tests per week while you're there, and then you were welcome. I don't know how many people they got, but it's probably, if you round it a little bit, precisely 0. Generals do not understand anything about tourism. I mean, that's pretty clear. Also, there's no talk about getting rid of the quarantine. I mean, nobody is saying, oh, maybe we should just really stop this nonsense with the quarantine, or oh, maybe we should vaccinate our people. Thailand is way behind almost everybody else in terms of vaccination. The generals are in no particular rush to reopen the country, because while it's closed, it's so easily controlled, right? So we'll have a Thailand that is tightly controlled by a small bunch of idiots, basically. And only those with a lot of money will come in. But I just don't see it. If I was really rich and I had a yacht and I was a golf player, that this would entice me under the eyes of the generals, to do my golfing in Thailand. I'm not so sure that this will work. So there are 3 generals. I got this photo from some press agency or newspaper, what? And on the left, on the left, that's the 3 guys who, kind of built this scheme. And it so happens they're from the digital promotion agency of Thailand, right? So they're not really from the tourism sector at all. And so they understand as little about tourism as do the generals, right? They just understand how to create this lovely wristband. And I bet you these 3 people all have a personal share in that company that produces the wristband. So this is basically a big corruption scheme. Hey, we have this lovely wristband that can receive GPS data and send data about your blood pressure. Let's create a government-sponsored scheme that allows us to sell our wristbands. And they will sell them maybe not to the tourists, or maybe they sell them directly to the tourists, or they sell them to the government then gives them to the tourists. If they sell them to the government, they will just triple or quadruple the price, because government, always pays, right? And, there will be someone on the government side who does the procurement, who will obviously do very, very well out of this, and then share with their cronies among the generals. So, and here you have a wonderful scheme. The only problem is, it will attract, 0 interest. 40 million arrivals per year, not 20 million. Yeah, 40 million arrivals. So they're looking for probably a few hundred. Now that's really a great scheme. So this scheme deserves a prize. So remember last time I talked about the so-called 3 wise monkeys, and I said, well, it seems a bit about don't say anything, don't look, and shut up and comply. That's my interpretation of the so-called Asian wise monkeys. And so these 3 gentlemen on the left, they just look to me just like these 3 monkeys. So I will be officially awarding with this gesture here, and you are my witnesses. I'm officially rewarding this beautiful prize to these 3 gentlemen for their fantastic scheme. Okay, now what else can we find? This is a good one. BBC. I love this transparent in transparency. So. On the BBC News, there was one of these running bands at the bottom on my TV that's saying, oh, some studies showed that, this whole track and trace, or trace and test, or test and trace scheme was not working. They said it cost £37 billion over 2 years, so that may include this year. And it's making no measurable difference. 37 billion pounds. Maybe they should have given some of that to the Thai generals to make up for the lost tourism. Now, of course, it doesn't work. I mean, as I've been saying for the last 12 months or 10, these schemes don't work, right? Partially just because the nature of the virus, it's not like SARS-1. It doesn't primarily depend on super spreader events, where this kind of tracing at least logically, I mean, it's obviously illegal and inhuman and so on, but apart from that, it could at least be effective if the virus behaves similarly to SARS-1, but it doesn't. Right? I talked about this, dispersion factor is, the technical term, I think Greek letter tau, right? It measures what proportion of infections happen in a concentrated versus decentralized way. And this virus, it's sort of a mixed bag. Whereas in the SARS-1, you recall, almost all transmissions took place around superspreader events, so very concentrated. And if you have that situation, then you can at least logically see how a trace and test system, could function, even if it's illegal, etc. But at least it could be, if you like, functional, right? But with this virus, this kind of scheme is not going to be functional, right? Except for maybe in very, very limited ways, and very specific, maybe events or locations or so. So, if the government had asked me, I could have told them to, you can save those 37 billion pounds wasted, right? But I mean, we're wasting so much money these years. It doesn't matter, right? It's a rounding error compared to what the British government has wasted over the last 12 months. Primarily, of course, in 10% GDP loss, right? Which is mind-boggling numbers. These numbers are so big, I can't even fathom them. And now, of course, they have to make up for it to the people who are suffering. And so they're making handouts. And whoever shouts loudest gets the biggest handout. So under the cover of COVID, we're now having a social redistribution mechanism going on. And the end result will just be that all these Western countries and some Eastern countries as well will be massively in debt. And it will take generations to pay that debt off. So talking about what we're doing to our children, all of this is at the expense of our children. But back to this particular article, what I loved about it is, you can't see that here because I paste, it's sort of a vertical stream, but I pasted one next to the other here on the screen, just because my screen is horizontal and not vertical, the format, yeah. So actually, it starts on the left and the headline reads, "How does the test and trace system work?" So hidden inside an article about how it works is the criticism. The headline isn't, "Oh, the scheme isn't working." No, the headline is, "How does it work?" As if it was working. And then deep inside you go like, "Oh, someone is saying it doesn't work at all." No, it doesn't. That's quite correct. But I love the way the BBC in this news stream put the essential, which is it's not working and it costs the taxpayer a huge amount of money that is completely wasted. They put that sort of underneath the headline, "How does the test and trace system work?" As if, if it was the most normal thing to have a test and trace system, as if we've always had a test and trace system, right? And, and as if people were asked, "Oh, I would like to know how it works." No, actually what people want to know is that the government is wasting 37 billion pounds, but they're hiding that underneath. So, I love this. And when I pick on the BBC, mind you, it's just because I happen to use the BBC a lot, right? Actually, that's a sign of my appreciating that they do cover the topics I'm interested in. Not that they always cover them well, but at least they cover topics I'm interested in, and it's in English. So since this presentation is in English, I need obviously English material. But I'm not picking on the BBC specifically. I mean, other news providers are just as bad, okay? But it's just fantastic what our media are doing with us in this period. So, what's this here? WebMD.com. Fauci, Mr. Fauci, he's that so-called expert in the United States. Children likely to get vaccinated early 2022. It's fantastic. These technocrats, right? They just tell you, "Oh, here's our schedule," and the children will be. He doesn't have a conversation here about why are we vaccinating children at all? I mean, children obviously don't need this vaccination, zero, right? I mean, none of them need this vaccination. But there's not a question here, well, should we or should we not? And who should we vaccinate? No. It's just, oh yeah, in early next year, the children will turn, yeah. To get to true herd immunity is a phrasing here. He said that, true herd immunity. I mean, I've been telling you for, I don't know how many months, 6 or 9, that there is no such thing as true herd immunity with this virus, right? I mean, by now, even Mr. Fauci, who is a technocrat, probably doesn't think, but, even he by now could have, come across that little fact that this common cold virus doesn't really get to true herd immunity. I also use that term, and I've explained to you how I use it. Huh? I've said herd immunity to me means people have had the virus once or have been vaccinated, and then most likely they'll never get ill of the virus again, right? Just like with other common cold viruses. So it's not herd immunity as it's normally used, which is, at a certain level of penetration with the virus, the activity of the virus goes down just statistically. That's what herd immunity normally is. I use it slightly differently in a way where I think it makes sense for this particular virus, on the assumption that once you've encountered the virus once, you're very unlikely to ever have a problem with that virus again, even with the mutations in almost all cases. So that's how I use it. But Mr. Fauci talks of true herd immunity and not recognizing there's no such thing with this virus. And it will help schools to resume. So the guy is talking about early 2022. So what, is he saying the children cannot go to school for another year? Is that what he's saying? And I mean, he can say whatever he wants, but there are people who have this misperception that he knows what he's talking about. And he doesn't. He doesn't know what he's talking about, but there are a lot of people in the US and maybe outside the US, I presume, who actually believe he knows what he's talking about. And they take this at face value. Now that's their fault. They are not thinking themselves, or they can only blame themselves for that. Cannot blame others. But if you're a public person and you have these titles, he's the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, these fancy titles, right? I think you have some responsibility. I mean, mind your words. Remember that dude at the World Health Organization who triggered the whole thing by declaring a pandemic that actually isn't a pandemic, right? I mean, mind your words, Mr. Fauci. But it's hilarious. It's hilarious. This is, year 1 after Homo sapiens, right? And I think it's brilliant, fits. Oh, this is one of my favorites. Always, whenever the World Health Organization says something, I get so excited. This is a great one. Okay, top World Health Organization official says, this was early March, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to more mass trauma than after World War II. Oh, this is our good friend, Mr. Tedros, yeah, the boss. The guy who started it all, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the olden days, these people would have been, drawn and quartered, But nowadays, you get some kind of like a pat on the back and, probably a salary raise for what he's doing. So, you, Mr. Tedros, you created this mass trauma. This is your mass trauma with your rather precipitous declaration of a global pandemic. You have triggered it all, right? So this is your work. Great. This mass trauma, Mr. Tedros, it's your work. So good work. I love this. So he says these things. Oh, there's mass trauma, and the idea that he has anything to do with that doesn't apparently even come to his. Well, I don't know whether he's got a brain. I'm not sure. I mean, in his case, I'm really not sure. Most people, I think, do have a brain, even if they don't use it. But Mr. Tedros, maybe he's got some microchip implanted by someone or something else. Oh, that's maybe far-fetched. Maybe that's just empty. No jab, no job. This is now we're getting to the really fun part. It's really, like the scary kind of fun part. It's so scary that it's like in a horror movie, right? This kind of fun, yeah, and scary fun. Discrimination fears mounts, and now the companies are starting to say, "Oh, you can only work here if you've been vaccinated." I said before, the vaccination scheme will be the world's biggest discrimination and what's the word, crime scheme ever, right? It just opens the door to discrimination, of course, but also to really criminal activities. People will cheat. People will buy their vaccination passport. They will fake them. I mean, you name it, right? I mean, all of the above will obviously happen, right? And in a big way, right? If this becomes such a big thing, if this vaccination passport becomes, your ticket to being treated like a human being, well, I mean, this is going to be bigger than drugs and illegal weapons and fake money combined, right? So the governments are working very hard on making sure that the crime rate goes up shortly. It's fantastic. And here it continues, right? IATA, this is the Global Association of Airlines. Of course, their interest is to get airlines back operating. That's understandable, but I mean, that would be so easy to do. You just say, okay, everybody can travel, and that's it, right? I mean, it would be so easy, right? Boom, I could do that like that. But no, they say, oh, we have to have a technology solution. We have to have standardized, accurate information about each traveler. Yeah, so all the things, if you cared in the past about privacy protection, forget it, right? It's dead, right? Privacy protection, dead. Now that was something for Homo sapiens, anyways. Since we're not Homo sapiens, we don't have privacy. That thing does not exist, right? I mean, we're like cattle. Cattle have no privacy. They have no rights and they have no privacy. So welcome to cattle class. This will be so much fun, right? Imagine you're at your check-in and you have your vaccination passport and, oh, sorry, sir, but this particular vaccination, we don't accept. the destination country doesn't accept. Oh, it's expired. Isn't it more than 6 months? It's not acceptable. The antibodies in your blood will go down. Yeah, that's scientifically proven. Yeah, and therefore, sorry, you can't travel. You can travel from one side of the road to the other side of the road and carry your virus there, but you cannot travel across international borders because international borders are sacrosanct. There's something special. Yeah, I mean, you can you can visit one city and another city in your own country. That's okay. I mean, the virus is happily traveling with you there. But as soon as there is an international border, a different nation state, then you can't, right? And anyways, air travel is always treated differently. Remember I talked about this before, the 9/11 fallout was basically that air travelers were punished with lengthy waiting periods at so-called security checks, right? Which were a result, an outcome of Osama bin Laden, having been so successful, right? He tried to do something that would last, and he did. Thanks to all of us who contribute to his scheme, right? By lining up at a security gate every time we take a flight, and of course on the other end when we arrive again. No, you do the same trip by train or by car. No. There's no security issue there. Okay, only on flights. Yeah. So the air travelers have, of course, always been treated in a special way. It's called discrimination, by the way, but yeah, special treatment. Right? So if you're a frequent traveler, frequent air traveler, life will be fun in the next few years. Oh, this will be so much fun. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, the world's greatest ever discrimination corruption scheme. I think I sort of said that already. Oh yeah, it continues now. It gets better. It gets better and better. I mean, I'm having so much fun. So this is some kind of French publication that talks about the EU Digital Health Pass. Health Pass is a great name because it sort of suggests that it makes you healthier. No, it's actually a spying pass, right? It allows the government officially to spy on you, on your personal data. It's not a health pass, it's a spy pass. But shh, don't say that. Don't say that. Come on. We don't want to know the truth. Come on. Truth is no fun. Okay, and it starts here. The voluntary digital green certificate. I don't know what's green about the certificate, by the way. But in some countries, they had the so-called green line, which basically meant, I think, your quarantine was a little bit reduced or some other such thing. I have no idea what the green stands for. Maybe they are thinking of traffic lights. You know, green light means you're allowed to pass. You are kosher. Yeah, I don't know. But so voluntary is the word here. It's voluntary. But then you read sort of the small print and, yeah, it's voluntary, but if you don't have it, either you can't travel at all, or you have 2 weeks of quarantine, or maybe on both ends, and I don't know, all kinds of terror. So of course it's not voluntary. It's being forced on all of us, just like the vaccinations are being forced on all of us, right? And it will have your name and date of birth, okay, like your IC card, passport number, okay. Now it gets interesting. Whether you have vaccinated or not, the type of vaccine you've had. Now, mind you, some people have been vaccinated once, others already twice. I don't know how this is going to deal with that. If you've had one shot but not two, are you going to be okay, or are you going to be not okay? I wonder, right? But the best one is, okay, of course, which type of vaccine you've had. As I already said before, there will be a whole list, and governments will say, this one we accept, this one we accept. This one is not admitted in the EU. So let's say the Sputnik one or the Chinese one, currently not admitted in the EU. So sorry, that doesn't count. You may have had the virus 3 times already, naturally. Plus, you may have had 2 shots of, some vaccine, and you're still not okay. Because, oh, sorry, you had the wrong vaccine. Yeah. And you can't prove that you had the virus. How do you prove? So this is the best one. And it shows if you had already had COVID-19. So how the hell would you know? I mean, do these people realize that in 90% of the cases, people have no or slight symptoms, or more than 90%, and 99% actually. And in most of those cases, they never go to a hospital, and therefore they never get diagnosed or tested, right? Now, you may have been in some random testing scheme, or when you enter the country, you may have already gathered a few tests in your life. But these tests, are pretty meaningless. Okay, they show you, or maybe at some point, if you had one positive, then you go, oh, I was positive, last year. Yeah, but what does it mean? Maybe your antibodies are already gone, right? You're already susceptible again to being reinfected by the same virus, right? As I said many times, we will get continuously reinfected by this virus, just like all other common cold viruses. So the whole point of, oh, I've had this virus. Yeah, so what? It means nothing, right? Of course, if you've had it recently, then they may say, okay, then you probably still have antibodies. But even someone with antibodies may still be able to transmit the virus, right? They may not get sick. Anyways, almost nobody's going to get sick soon. Within a few months from now, very few people will get seriously sick. Anyways, right? Yeah, but if this is about monitoring transmissibility, this is going to be a nightmare. I mean, try to monitor a common cold. By the way, I have a common cold right now, so I apologize for my nasal voice. I don't think it's got any SARS-CoV-2 in it, because SARS-CoV-2, as you know, in Singapore is completely forbidden, right? It's illegal. Yeah? It has been illegalized. It's not allowed to, to exist here, at least not officially, right? So therefore, obviously, I can't have SARS-CoV-2 in my cocktail of cold viruses, but they're nevertheless pretty nasty. It's a pretty bad cold, actually. So anyways, so yeah, so we're going to get to a world in which we will trace all your common colds. You're going to have 2 to 4 per year, by the way, and in irregular intervals, and with each time with a different mix of viruses. So it's going to be hugely fun. Yeah, it's going to be amazing. I mean, and given that, I mean, our government are not able to trace even the simplest things, this is going to be amazing. I mean, are we going to queue at the airport for hours and hours and hours for someone to sort out which category do you fit in, and can you get on the plane or not? Maybe there will be a whole industry springing up around this. This is an opportunity for entrepreneurs, right? Maybe that's the point. Now, it gets better still. The pass is intended to be a provisional measure until the World Health Organization says the pandemic is over. The World Health Organization! Now, they lied to us when they said there is a pandemic. So now we're waiting until they lie again and say, oh, now the pandemic is over. So maybe it's time to send Mr. Tedros maybe onto that, nice yacht to Thailand. Please, Mr. Tedros, please say the word. The World Health Organization is under no democratic control whatsoever. But 7.8 billion people on this planet, if it's according to these EU officials here, technocrats, right, non-thinking technocrats, 7.8 billion of us will now depend on Mr. Tedros. Maybe he's going to be asking an astrologer, or I don't know, to declare the pandemic over before we can travel again the way we used to. Right now, I mean, if I had a few million, I would immediately start bribing the guy. Right? Yeah, of course. Yeah, I would. Yeah. If the bribe can avert a crime, maybe that's a good bribe. But I don't have a few million, and the guy is probably expensive. But yeah, the Thai government should immediately invite him onto one of their yachts and the golf course, and then say, Mr. Tedros, actually, why don't you, declare the crisis over, the pandemic, and then we the governments can act, right? So here's an EU organization that is normally subject to elected governments, now making itself subject to an unelected dude who, as I said earlier, probably doesn't have a brain. That's great. Okay. Okay, and then but every country can then treat, even though EU normally has a so-called Schengen space, which means you can freely move around. That's of course gone, right? Basically, the EU as such doesn't exist anymore. They just haven't realized it. It has no more meaning, right? Other than blocking vaccinations. They're very good at that. But other than blocking the vaccinations or slowing them down, they have no more function. Right? So each country can then independently use the scheme the way they want, right? Do they accept this vaccine or that vaccine? Do they, is there 6 months or some other deadline on it, expiration date, right? What else can we put onto this beautiful so-called green certificate? What other data do we want to spy on? Maybe other health data. Oh, have you got your, I don't know, basic vaccinations for, if not, oh, we don't want you in our country. It's our country. It's not your world. It's my world. Oh, this will be so much fun. Yeah, and states will be able to decide whether they accept the Sputnik and the Sinopharm, and yeah, exactly. So each state does something different, and everybody will be confused, and we'll all just burrow down into the earth and live underground. Because this will be so messy. Don't worry, people, nobody will want to travel under these circumstances. No, we'll just become, underground creatures like the Morlocks, if you remember, in Brave New World, right? Is it Brave New World or Time Machine? The Morlocks. Yeah, Time Machine, sorry. Yeah, the Morlocks are the ones who live, underground, and occasionally they eat some of those Eloi, those pretty young humanoids who are living, on top. They grab them and, yeah, so maybe we'll all become Morlocks. And, maybe we don't even need this certificate. Yeah. Okay. This is one of my favorites. This is this kind of completely brain dead saying that sort of becomes a meme, right? And goes around. You are not safe until everyone is safe. Yeah. All those gray-haired UN folks. Technocrats, yeah. Technocrats who've been around for too long. They're past their sell-by date. They in unison, they say these things, right? Obviously without ever thinking about what they're saying, right? Basically, this means 7.85 billion, which is the number of people on this planet at the moment, are being held hostage. That's what it means, right? You are not allowed to behave like a human being until we decide, Mr. Tedros tells us, now it's time to be human again. Wait, you don't have any say in this. No, this is not a democratic process. No individual right. Forget it. No. We'll tell you. When, and whoever we is, I wonder, who is this we? Who is now deciding everything in our lives for us? Yeah, who is this we? Okay, here's us, right? I try to find some pretty pictures of us. You can find yourself here. Are you the cute one here on the left, or the evil looking in the middle, or the hungry ones on the right? This is the cattle class. This is how it will look on airplanes in the future, right? Or anywhere in your town where you live. You want to go to some event, or yeah, cattle, right? You see their little ear thingies here. They have like little numbers. That's us in the future, right? With our health certificates and our vaccination passports and so on. We'll be just like these cows. Every one of us will not only be registered, we're already registered through our IC cards, etc., but we will be transparent and we can be slaughtered anytime. Right? Just like we have no rights. We are no longer considered humans, right? So, anything goes, right? We'll be like cattle. So, maybe you start getting used to eating grass because it's coming. Yeah, we are, in fact, in a second wave. Last year was the age of stupidity, and this year I declare as the age of totalitarianism. We'll all be part of one beautiful, big data machine. And nobody in the end will even control it, right? I'm not suggesting there's that one person, that Bill Gates or whoever, sitting in the back and manipulating it all. No, not at all. Nobody. It's just all of us, like the lemmings, they all run together and then plump into the ocean and drown. Yeah, so they say. Actually, I don't think it's true, but that's that's the story anyways. And we are like that. Right? All of us, we're just blindly following someone, and we don't know who it is we're following because there's no real leader here, right? We're just all, I think I said before, we are a bit like those fish in a swarm. They have antenna or an instinct. They have, of course, they have organs, sense organs, right, around the body, where they keep exactly the same distance to the other fish. And if in the front of the swarm, some fish move left, then in a matter of milliseconds, the whole swarm moves left and then right and left. So they behave as if they were one. And nobody can really point out there's one clear leader at the front who sets the tone. No, it can be different leaders at different times. And, it may be different reasons. Maybe it's some external reason, and maybe there's a shark coming, and or maybe it's just plain, instinct or impulse, even without any reason. Pure accidental impulse. Whatever it is, everybody else does the same, and so they wandering birds are similar, right? They fly in formation. Yeah. So there's no brain in the back that manipulates all of this, or like a puppet player who moves us around. No. Well, it's just an automatic instinct that we have to completely shut down our own individual thinking and just follow the crowd. It's pure crowd behavior, right? And as I said before, I mean, this explains fully how, for example, the Nazis and the Holocaust and all these types of events could take place. It's exactly the same mechanism, right? Yeah, so welcome to the cattle farm. And yeah, with that, I wanted to end this first part of my presentation before I go into the data with a Homeric laugh or Homeric laughter. Homeric laughter is something that takes place in Homer's works, in the Iliad, for example, where when the gods, the Olympian gods, they have fun watching humans get into trouble. And when they see some humans doing something really silly and getting themselves into deep shit, and the gods sit up there on the Olymp and they laugh and laugh. They can't stop, because it's so hilarious to them to see these humans running around, like sheep, headlessly, and just making life hard for themselves. So I wanted to share that with you, but it's animated. So let me show you the animated version. Let us enjoy that together. Okay. There it is. So obviously this character is called Homer after the famous poet. He's one of the Simpsons, if you remember. And of course, Homer laughs Homerically. And he doesn't stop. I mean, he just goes on and on and on. And he's probably thinking of COVID. And he's thinking of these stupid humans. He's sitting on his Olymp, and looking down at it. Look, all of them wearing masks. There's nobody nearby, but they're wearing the mask anyways, just in case. Yeah. So there is such a thing, believe it or not, as laughter meditation. I'm not a practitioner of that, but I've joined once or twice in a laughter meditation, and it's so hilarious. There are people who are really experts. One of my colleagues she's really expert in making you meditate and laugh. So meditate by laughing. So I'm not expert on it, but just enjoy, just follow. My God. Okay, quiet now. This is good. This is good. Okay. Now, I will take you back to the presentation. That's enough of our laughter meditation for today. Now, where's my presentation? PowerPoint. There we are. Okay. Welcome back. Hope you had a laugh. Okay. Here we are again, tracking COVID-19 scenarios. Ta-da! April 2021, 12 months after we first created these scenarios in April 2020. Nothing has changed. For 12 months, we've been trending ever deeper into the fractured world. Remember, the fractured world is a world in which it turns out that the disease COVID-19 is rather moderate, and I've since changed my wording on that and called it insignificant. It's trending towards insignificant. It didn't start that insignificant when we look at fatalities, but it's increasingly becoming insignificant. And on the other axis, a world in which the effectiveness of the global response is ineffective and trending to, as I've been saying, trending towards disastrous. That's our definition of the fractured world. And of course, one of the elements of that fracture is the multi-speed that we've created among countries. Instead of responding as one global humanity, we've decided to respond as 200 nation states. And that's sort of the worst possible way to organize yourself, if you're responding to a perfectly global virus, right? It could not have been worse, probably, than having 200 nation states each do their thing. So we have, 200 different speeds at which things are developing, 200 different directions into which states are developing, and less compatible with each other. So the globalized world that we were getting used to until about a year ago, it's gone. It's gone. And there's little chance it will come back, in my view, by now. The longer and deeper we move into the fractured world, the less likely we'll go back to where we were before. Why am I saying that COVID-19 is trending towards insignificant? First of all, because it's moving towards 100% penetration of humanity at high speed. Excuse me. We're moving towards 100% penetration of humanity at pretty significant speed. According to my model, we are now at above 60% penetration, excluding China. The percentage of those infected who fall ill with COVID-19, as I said, it's sort of naturally, at or below 1%. But once you've had your first encounter with the virus or with the vaccine, it will trend towards zero. And with 60% of population having had their first encounter, and now increasingly people having their first encounter, those people who haven't yet had an encounter, having their first encounter with the help of vaccines, we are going to rapidly move. When I say rapidly, it will take months, not weeks, but visibly and measurably move towards zero, meaning COVID-19 will rarely occur. Very few people, in other words, will have pneumonia or will develop pneumonia because of this particular virus, SARS-CoV-2. Ever fewer and fewer people. And that's happening now. I mean, we're starting to see that. And, you know, if we think about this year, 2021, you know, towards the end of this year, we will already be near zero in my current thinking. We'll see. And the percentage of those infected who pass away in conjunction with this pneumonia, that's in my model is currently 0.19%. And that's going towards zero as well. Right? Now there is a question around, new mutations, if they're significant enough, could they be more dangerous or more fatal? Some studies suggest for the UK variant, for example, that it does seem to come with a higher fatality, but my best guess is that's just because it is different enough for some immune systems to not recognize it, even though these particular immune systems may have already encountered the original version or some other version of this virus. If the mutations become significant enough, the immune system may not be able to react, as effectively as you would like, right? And then you could have some cases where, severe illness does arise. So when I say we're going near zero, I can imagine over the next few years maybe that there will be, as new variants come about here and there, every now and then, there will be always a bit of a spike again in severe cases and fatalities for a little while until people have gotten used to it. My guess is, when it first occurred last year, the spike was very steep, right? And in terms of none of us had any prior knowledge of it. So therefore, 1% of humanity had the problem, right? Once we've been through this and a new variant comes about, maybe it's no longer 1% who have a problem, but maybe it's 0.2% or 0.3%. And then, more variants come and maybe then it's 0.1% and then 0.005% or whatever. You see what I'm saying? I think these oscillations will get smaller and smaller. We know from the other 200 common cold viruses that it's very rare that we develop a severe illness out of them. It does happen, but it's very rare, right? Even though all of those, of course, also mutate, right? Now, this virus is new to us. So just as we are trying to learn to deal with it, the virus is also trying to learn to deal with us, right? It's mutual. And so you can imagine that in the early stage, the virus does go through a lot of mutations because it's like, trial and error, right? Experimenting with what works best from their point of view. And that's a natural thing probably to occur. And our immune system, it knows one variant, but then here comes the next variant and it has to adjust again. Once it's seen 10 or 20 or 30 of these variants, you get ever better to fine tune, right? And ever faster. And so you could imagine conceptually that at the beginning, in the first few years, or I don't know how long this will take, maybe decades, maybe generations of humans even. But that it will get so there will be these oscillations every time some new variant arises. There may be a bit of a spike up in severe cases and fatalities, but then again it goes down again, and then the next variant comes, and this oscillation will get smaller and smaller and smaller as we go along until we reach a point where we just don't notice it, which is the case with the other 200 common cold viruses. So we've probably just been living with them for long enough to have gone through that adjustment period, that initial adjustment period where virus and host, mutually kind of have to get to know each other. Now our governments are doing everything they can to delay this natural process of getting to know each other, but they can't prevent it. It's going to happen anyways. It maybe takes a little longer because of these measures, but since they're not really effective, it won't delay that process. At least I hope will not delay that process very much. So we just have to go through that. So when I say it's going towards near zero, I do imagine that it could occasionally a new variant that is significantly different. Yeah, there will be a spike up again, but the spikes will get ever smaller and smaller to the point that we don't notice them at all, because the number of severe cases are so low that, you know, they disappear in the much wider quantity of pneumonias that we contract, right, from all sources. Right? So it will just simply disappear in that multitude. Yeah, but don't get me wrong when I say it goes towards near zero. That's it will go towards near zero, but not without some oscillations perhaps along the way, right? And it may take some time, years, or decades. Nothing to be excited about. It's just a natural, and maybe it's much faster than I think. I mean, normally these viruses are very quick in their mutation and their adaptation. It's just us making it so much more difficult for them. I mean, we're doing everything to make the thing worse, right? As I've said before. So I don't know quite how successful our policy will be in making this worse. It's hard to predict. I mean, the virus is so logical, right? And it's so easy to conceptualize what it's going to do, right? Because the virus is purely rational, just like nature, right? Purely rational. Or even the irrationality of it is rational because it allows for trial and error, et cetera, right? It's only humans who are not, right? We somehow extract ourselves from this nature and we don't participate in those processes that are so beautiful, right? And so functioning, right? The functional, right? And we refuse to be part of that nature, and but we can't fully extract ourselves from nature, right? We can't. Right? So we are in this really strange suspension between being inside nature and being out of nature. That is, it's a very risky, tricky position to be in. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And on the one hand, people say they are afraid, and on the other hand, they do everything they can to make it worse. It's just like those, people who say, "Oh, I'm so afraid of horror movies. That's why I go to horror movies." Yeah, it's human. Maybe we hate this virus so much that we love it, right? Or we love it so much that we fight it. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, we could have ignored it. That would have been one option, as I said before. If our governments were all chimpanzees and had just ignored it, we would be in a much better place now. But unfortunately, our politicians are not chimpanzees. Right? It's really too bad. Because they make everything worse. Yeah. So it's very difficult to predict, not because the virus is difficult to predict. The virus is easy enough to predict, very predictable. But policy, human nature and human policy is just totally irrational, and it's impossible to predict. Right? What crazy ideas people will come up with to make things worse. Right? So that's the caveat that I put to this when I say we are trending towards insignificant and irrelevant, really, unless we make it otherwise. Right? Keep that in mind. Okay, to the numbers that I know you're waiting for. You like the numbers, right? Okay. We are, as I said, we are progressing as expected towards 100% or near 100% penetration. We are at 61% according to my model. Remember last month I did some modifications to the model. That's why the numbers went down. It's not that the infections went down. Obviously they can't. Right? They can only go up. I mean, the percentage of population that has been infected can only go up. It cannot go down. So the graphic is just, it describes my assumptions rather than the real world. Right? Of course, it's meant to try to describe the real world, but basically it describes my assumptions. And when I change my assumptions, then actually the curve can go down or up. Right? Yeah. So last month I made some changes to my assumptions, and I spent some time explaining them to you. This time, by the way, I made another few changes to my model. I don't want to bore you with all these details, but just the main thing that I did, I Oh, here's the background. So Mexico, I have been saying since about a month ago, has reached herd immunity. In fact, they peaked in terms of registered cases. They peaked in late January. So that's now 2 months ago. Yeah. And since then, the cases are coming down, and then with a bit of delay, as always, the fatalities are also coming down. But they're not coming down quite as fast as I maybe assumed. And so if I just extrapolated on the previous assumptions, Mexico would by now be hitting nearly 100% penetration. And that cannot really be, because as you go beyond 80 and towards 100, it will flatten. The curve must flatten, right? It doesn't just go to zero, like to 100% like that, right? It sort of slows down and gradually moves in the direction of 100% without maybe ever reaching it, right? Or reaching it only after a very long period. So on the previous assumption, my model, Mexico by now would have hit something like 100%, and that cannot be the case, right? So there had to be something in the assumptions that wasn't quite working. And remember, I always said, if the real data, and when what I plug into in terms of real data that I plug into my model is the actual registered fatalities. They are one of the drivers, right? And they then, together with some other assumptions, they drive my infection levels here that you're seeing on this graph, right? So the fatalities, I take it what it is, and the government talks about the excess mortalities and what proportion of excess mortalities are COVID related, and I just usually take that at face value. I cannot usually find another source other than the official government source to double check whether this is credible. Of course, I sometimes apply my own judgment. That doesn't really sound very likely what they're saying, but usually I just have to take whatever data I get, and it's usually either from research teams or from governments. So I accept that when Mexico says we have so many fatalities, plus excess fatalities, and of those excess fatalities, a certain percentage are COVID-related excess fatalities, I basically take that at face value, right? And also what Mexico said recently was all kind of in line with, what I expected. So there was nothing in there that surprised me or that was incredible or so. So I take that, but with my assumptions, then they would reach 100% of infection level. And that's not the case, right? Because they're still having new infections every day, and they're still having fatalities for some time to come, right? So they're not at 100%, right? They're approaching 100%, but they're not at 100%, for sure. Therefore, I had to change my assumptions a bit. And so in the same week, when I had that revelation that, I had to make some change, there was an interesting article also about Mexico saying that Mexico had a high incidence of both obesity and sugar disease. What is the name in English? High sugar, yeah. Diabetes, thank you. Type 2 diabetes typically, but it could be type 1 and 2 combined. That's also fine. But basically the article said, okay, Mexico has high incidence in the population of both diabetes and obesity. Obviously, those two can be correlated too, but they are not the same thing. And they found in that study, or in that article, they talked about both of them are correlated with severe symptoms, meaning COVID-19, right? Which we already knew. That's not new. We knew that. I previously said, I'm just using age as the main, the main driver of IFR. Recognizing that there are other drivers. Remember, I said that repeatedly, but I also said I'm lazy and I don't want to, go into all these other details, and I just take age, as a proxy for everything, because a lot of these conditions are also correlated with age. Not all of them, but many of them are. So age seemed to be the best sort of single factor driving my model, and that's still the case. It's still by far the biggest factor, but when I looked at that, I say, yeah, of course, yeah. If Mexico is like a triple whammy, right? They have they have fairly positive demographics in the sense that it's quite a relatively young population. Not one of the very youngest, not like in Africa or so, but still a reasonably low mean age, and also reasonably low percentage of the population that is above 65, which is my metric that I'm using, right? So from a demographic point of view, Mexico has a pretty low IFR. Therefore, you take the fatalities, multiply them with the IFR, you get a pretty high number of cases, right? And that gets you then to the 100% of population having been infected, right? And then I said, okay, so obviously, if I know that Mexico, from this article, that Mexico has a high incidence of these two other factors that are significant drivers, and plus there was another study being done about Africa a while ago by the World Health Organization. They tried to load their assumptions with sort of a healthcare efficiency or effectiveness, I should say, effectiveness factor. So how effective is the healthcare system, and that should play into how many fatalities you have. That makes some sense. Although it's very hard to figure out what exactly, drives fatalities, right? In terms of, people don't get hospitalized because there's no hospital nearby, or they don't get diagnosed in time, or the hospitals are not well equipped, or the people are not well trained, or, it's complicated, right? To say, yeah, of course, better healthcare system, you probably will reduce the fatalities, but by how much is not so easy to figure out. By some amount, but not, necessarily a huge amount. So, plus, what's the quality of a healthcare system? That's really hard to assess, even though there are some global studies on that. So that's why so far I've refrained from looking into these things. But I realized then that, sorry, Mexico has a triple whammy. And not only Mexico, but at that point I was just concerned with Mexico because it was, in my model, it was hitting 100% penetration, and I couldn't agree with that, right? So, okay, high diabetes, high obesity, and modest healthcare, quality of healthcare systems. So on the one hand, pretty positive or decent demographics, right? Keeps the IFR low. But then on the other hand, you have those other three factors, all of which could drive the IFR higher. And then I said, okay, so if I build these three factors, percentage of population with diabetes, percentage of population that are obese, and then some kind of a quality of healthcare kind of factor. If I build those three things into my model, Mexico will be one of the countries for which it will drive the IFR higher than it was previously in my model. Based on pure demographics, the IFR is low. If I load up these other three factors, it will drive Mexico's IFR higher, and some other countries as well. Conversely, there will be some countries where it's quite obvious, like take Japan, right? In my previous model, I said, okay, I just take percentage of population above 65 as the only driver of IFR. Japan has the most aged society in the world. So therefore, in my model, Japan had the highest IFR of all countries. However, we all know intuitively that elderly Japanese are very healthy often. They are much healthier than, their peer group in other countries, right? Because of their food and lifestyle and whatnot. We kind of know that, right? So I know that too, right? So, yeah, so in my model, Japan had this really high IFR, but I know actually the IFR is going to be lower than that because of other factors, right, that I'm just not simply taking into account. So if you look up diabetes, obesity, and quality of healthcare for Japan, you find on all three, it drives the Japanese IFR lower. So Mexico goes up, Japan goes down, right? And of course, all other countries are also in there. Yeah. So by using, in addition to a percentage of population above 65, which is still the main driver, it's probably 80% of the total, adding diabetes, obesity, and healthcare system allows me to recalibrate all countries relative to each other. I decided not to change my IFR, my global IFR is still 0.19%. So the global average has not changed. It's just that I recalibrate the countries more finely. So some go up in terms of IFR and some go down, right? Yeah. So the model gets a bit closer to reality, if you like, that's all, right? Now it's tricky to do because to figure out what weight should those different factors have is really tricky, almost impossible, at least for me with my limited, time and resource. Also, they're all intercorrelated. So, to really build a robust model of this would really be a major effort. And, maybe someone is doing it somewhere in the world, but I'm not going to choose. So I just played around and, okay, this looks logical. This, so for example, if you compare Germany and Japan, right? Japan has the highest age bracket, and then Germany is the second in the world, at least among the main countries that I'm tracking. Right? Which meant in the previous model, Japan had the highest IFR, followed by Germany. And they were fairly close. But now that I loaded that with the other three factors, so both countries have the same factor for healthcare system, which is the highest possible factor of countries, and I'm using some, I think, UN or other global study that ranks them, So they are equal in terms of healthcare system, but in terms of diabetes and obesity, Germany is significantly higher than Japan, which means in the new model, German IFR goes up, Japanese IFR goes down, and now the German IFR is significantly higher. Before it was this way, now it's this way. Yeah. So you see how that plays, right? So if you look at any pair of countries, you can see how they, relative to each other, they will have shifted a little bit. Yeah, not too much. I'm not trying to make these new factors too important in the model. As I say, I think the original one, the proportion of population that is above 65, is still probably accounts for 80% or so of the total. Yeah. 75% of the total. So I didn't mean to make these new factors, again, they are not new, we knew that, but new to my model, make them too weighty. Otherwise, it would really change, relative position of countries tremendously, right? And I didn't mean to do that. But, I played around with it and came to something that looks reasonable and plausible, and so that's what I'm using now. I'll continue watching that, whether it works fine or not, but for now, that's what I do. Yeah, and it does, for some countries, has a significant impact. The United States, for example, last time I said the US has already reached 60%, or almost 60%, I think it was 58.9 or something like that. Now, the US happens to have the highest proportion of the population that is obese, and one of the highest that is diabetic. Again, those are to some degree correlated, but they're not exactly correlated. You can, for example, when you look at them, you can see that diabetes mostly takes place 60, 65 and higher. So more elderly, the more elderly, the more likely you get diabetes. Whereas obesity mostly affects people sort of between 40 and 60. Not the elderly are less likely to be obese, maybe because when they grew up, they had healthier lifestyles, and they kept them throughout their lives. Or maybe just because even in their old age, they eat not so foolishly, and Whereas, the 40 to 60 years old are where a lot of the obesity takes place. In some cases, or in some places like the US, the obesity can start quite early in the population. You see it already among, the 30-year-olds, even 20-year-olds, even children. Yeah, but the bulk is sort of 40 to 60 in that age group, whereas the bulk of the diabetes people is between 60 and 80. Okay, so you can see that they may be correlated to some degree. If you are obese, you're more likely to get diabetes. That's probably the case, right? But they are not the same thing. So, but in the US, both are, just like in Mexico, both are big factors. And so that drives the US IFR significantly higher. As a result of which, now the penetration in the US is not 58.9, but instead 51 or so. So, 8 percentage points or so less. So it's quite significant. Yeah. So for individual countries, the change in the model may be quite significant. For the world as a whole, it's not, because the average IFR remained the same. And I did it such that I didn't touch the IFR because I don't want to touch too many things at the same time, right? Okay, I'm just changing the relative distribution of the IFRs of the individual countries relative to each other, but the average remains the same. Yeah. anyway, so that's one change to the model, just to let you know. What happened in the last months? We saw a few interesting developments. US and the UK especially, also Chile, which I've added to my list, are showing real impact from vaccinations. You're really seeing fatalities dropping significantly. And at least to a degree, that must be related to the massive rollouts of vaccinations. So you're seeing the leading countries in terms of vaccination rollout having a real impact on fatalities, a positive impact on fatalities. So that's one development. So in the US and UK, you can really see not only fatalities, also cases are coming down, partially because of the end of season and other factors. To some degree, of course, the vaccination will also slow down the virus, right? Not entirely, but to some degree, it will slow down the virus. So you see cases coming down, but you see fatalities coming down even more steeply. So in places like the US and the UK, you're starting to see almost the same effect that you would see if you had reached a natural herd immunity of like 80% penetration, let's say, where you really start to see the fatalities going down, like in Iran, South Africa, Mexico, where we're seeing that, right? The US and the UK are not at 80% yet. They're at 50 and a bit. So they are still quite far away from that 80% where naturally the fatalities would decline. But thanks to the vaccinations, they're getting that same effect. So the vaccinations really are having a visible effect on fatalities now in these countries, especially US, UK, and to some degree Chile. The rest of the world, not yet. I suspect in Europe, where they're running a bit behind with the vaccinations, we'll probably start seeing that effect next month. So when we meet again in a month's time, maybe I will be talking about that. And other countries may be much further behind. I'll share some of that data later. So at the moment, it's primarily US and UK, but those are important countries, especially the US, of course, you remember had more fatalities, recorded fatalities than any other country, recorded fatalities. Yeah, India probably has more actual fatalities than the US, but they're not all recorded, right? So, but the US was one of the key drivers of fatalities, and that's now coming to an end. Yeah, and that, of course, is one explanation why there is a flattening of the curve. Even if you take out the waviness that comes from changing assumptions, basically 1st of February, I was too aggressive to get it up to 60, then I had to correct. And so, so if you just drew more of a steady line through these numbers, what you would observe is it's starting to slow down. It's still increasing, but the amount of increase is slowing down. And so there's a brake effect. And that brake effect is, first of all, in the US and the UK because of vaccines. And increasingly in the next few months, that will spread to other parts of the world, that braking effect. The second thing we've seen that is putting a brake on things is we are getting to the end of the cold season in the Northern Hemisphere. And that shows in some countries, not in all countries, especially some European countries that had a very heavy lockdown in sort of January, early February. They are now coming back. They're calling it the third wave, but as I explained many times, it's a self-made wave, right? They've made that wave through their actions, through their lockdowns. They locked down, and now the yo-yo effect, it's shooting back up, right? And some countries are even doing yet another lockdown, like in France. They've just announced yet another lockdown. So they love their oscillations. But anyways, the net effect is not very big, as I said many times. That's why I keep saying it's not effective, right? It's counterproductive, actually, in some ways. But anyways, it's a different topic. I suspect what's happening is that because of the lockdowns, this virus is just part of a general common cold and flu and whatever stuff going around, right? Now, these viruses are used to certain patterns, and each year is probably a bit different because climate is different, etc. But they need to they need to achieve a certain amount of spreading before the summer comes, when they will lie low, and many of them will just die away without having any opportunity to transmit themselves, right? So for the species to survive, they need to do their thing during the winter, right? Now we artificially reduce that this winter through our lockdowns, at least in some European countries. I suspect the virus is just coming back and saying, oh, we are not done yet. We need to do a bit more spreading, right? And so basically that means we may be just extending the cold season. In my heuristic, I had said 21st of March, beginning of spring should be the end of the cold season. Of course, that's not so precise. That's just a heuristic for me. Now I would say, oh, maybe we've extended the cold season by a few weeks. So maybe mid-April will be the end of the cold season, right? Just simply because we've pushed it out through our measures. So we are starting to see a break onto these numbers in the Northern Hemisphere because of the end of the common cold season, but because of our measures, that end of the common cold season may be coming a few weeks later than usual. So there's a breaking effect, but it's not yet a full breaking effect. And in some countries, it's just yo-yoing back up again at the moment. And so it's like really, there's no uniform picture because different countries have different policies. I said this before, right? The virus would be fairly uniform, but because of our diversity of our policies, between the different countries doing very different things on very different timescales, it's all over the place. Right? Some countries go up, other countries go down, and even though they are next to each other, right? They're neighbors and they have the same climate, they have the same viruses going around, but because of the different policy, the numbers look very different. So it's a bit of a messy picture at the moment in Europe, but of course the trend eventually, so that maybe in a month's time when we talk again, by that time I will probably say, oh yeah, the end of the season has arrived, and it's there's a secular decline in both cases and fatalities. Plus, by that time also, as I said, the vaccinations in Europe probably start really having an impact outside the UK. Yeah, so so there's breaking effects which slow this curve down. There are also some counter effects. There are quite a number of countries right now where we see growing numbers again. Remember we talked about India, and we were puzzled by India having been low for quite a while and clearly it isn't at herd immunity yet. So, I mean, there should be activity, and we were wondering why is there no activity? And then we had this thought that maybe it's just multi-speed. Some provinces are already saturated, others are only at the beginning, also between urban and rural, big differences in India, and probably the same in many other places where you have strong rural population, like in Africa, for example. So multi-speed, and India being such a big country, it's like a continent, right? You really have multi-speed. Plus you have different policies on the level of provinces. So that comes on top, right? So you have a very fragmented and mosaic of things happening. And I said it is possible, almost coincidentally, that for a while, virtually all major provinces were going slow at the same time, right? But sooner or later, some of these provinces that haven't yet had a very significant penetration, it will come, right? And that's what happened in the last months or 6 weeks. That there are just a couple of major provinces that are now reporting massive increases in numbers because it was just due. Yeah. Previously, somehow the virus hadn't been so active there, but there it is now, right? It was just a matter of time. And these provinces are so populous that it's really driving up the overall Indian figures again. So India is back. Turkey, similar. Remember, I was speculating whether Turkey might already be at herd immunity because it had a pattern that looked very much like that in Iran. But it turns out, no, Turkey is still far from herd immunity. There was just a lull, and maybe the western provinces nearer to Europe and the big urban centers like Istanbul or so already had a lot of activity, and also maybe the area near the border with Iran, because Iran has a high activity. So if there is local border traffic, which I don't know what's the situation, whether there is or not, but if there were, then you would maybe in those eastern provinces you would see activity, but then in the whole stuff in between, Turkey is a big country, it may have been quieter. So whatever it is now, it's driving up again, and not only the cases but also the fatalities. So therefore, it's clear that Turkey isn't at herd immunity. And in the meantime, I've also used some new fatality figures again, as I did last month. I went back again and unified my sources a bit and reduced the excess mortality figures in quite a lot of countries. Talk about that in a moment, including in Turkey. Yeah, Turkey is still far away from herd immunity, and there is now a renewed activity. I don't know exactly what's driving it, or is it geographically, or is it urban versus rural, or is it different age groups? I mean, if you had a country where children were prevented from going to school, and then all of a sudden people say, okay, we open the schools again, of course you will get a big boom in children being infected naturally, right? Because they finally have an opportunity to get infected, right? So yeah, these factors, they're so complex and so diverse across geographies that it's impossible for me to even try to track them all, right? So whatever's driving Turkey, I don't know, but it's back, right? And there are quite a number of countries that are currently more active in Africa. Pakistan is coming back in parallel with India, Bangladesh, same. So it's a very mixed picture. You also now have the beginning of the winter or autumn season in the southern hemisphere. So we're starting to see Argentina coming back, for example, and I'm now, of course, watching carefully what's happening in South Africa, because I'm saying the numbers of infection in South Africa ought to soon start rising again, because people will get a second infection. Even though they already have herd immunity, they will get infected again, because some of them had their infection more than 9 months ago, and they may already have no longer the immediate protection by, ready at hand antibodies. So they could reinfect themselves, and they would possibly show up in those statistics, but they would not die. So in other words, I call it decoupling. Remember, I said in those countries, the numbers of cases can go up without the number of fatality going up, right? And South Africa will be interesting to watch over the next 2-3 months when there is, the winter. You would expect cases to go back up, but fatalities to stay low. They may go up a little bit because, of course, as I always say, there are still some people who have not yet been infected. 20% or so of the population have not yet been infected, including elderly people. So there will still be fatalities. And if there is a significant movement in the general population, even if it's secondary infection, doesn't even matter, right? Because the secondary infection, they're just passing it on, and eventually it gets to those people who had not yet been exposed, right? So therefore, you might see some increase in fatalities in the winter, but it wouldn't be huge. It would be a modest increase, because the pool of people not yet exposed is getting smaller and smaller, right? So even if there's a lot of activity going around, there will not be many people who get infected who had not been infected before, and therefore may be at risk of having severe symptoms. Yeah, so South Africa will be interesting to watch. Argentina is interesting to watch for a different reason. It's not yet at herd immunity, I believe, but it might well get there quite soon. Within the next 2-3 months, it might well get to herd immunity. So since they are now getting into their active winter season, it will be interesting to watch whether we can see the point at which the herd immunity level, comes in. I'll be watching that. So I'm usually picking some countries where I think there could be something interesting happening, and I, look at them a bit more closely. So South Africa and Argentina will be on the list because they're Southern Hemisphere. Chile, also Chile is kind of mixed. It's such a long country. Part of it is really tropical, and part of it is Southern Hemisphere. But yeah, Chile, more interesting because of the vaccination progression there, which is very rapid. So I'll be watching that. So, these are some of the things that, either I have been observing this month or I expect to be monitoring next month. But, net effect is that the infection level continues to rise as it would, right? I mean, as I said, it can't go down, it can only go up. But you can see the curve is starting to flatten. And that's really what we had always expected. Beyond 60%, you would start seeing a flattening of the curve. And I think we are. And what's coming in now is the vaccinations, which accelerate that. And they overlay the natural progression, right? And slow down developments further, so that the flattening of the curve in the next few months will be stronger because of the vaccinations than it would otherwise have been. Yeah, that's the infection levels. Let me talk about fatalities. So we are with the IFR 0.19, we would expect 12.2 million fatalities by the time we have full penetration. Now this is a bit artificial. As I said earlier, I actually expect that even once everybody has been infected once, there will be new variants, and some unlucky people, even though they had already been successfully through the first variant, when the second variant hits them, they may still be in trouble, right? So over time, if we project out the next decades, there will be additional fatalities in excess of these 12.2 million. The 12.2 million is simply saying, if everybody was only infected once, or if there was only one variant, let's put it this way, and if everybody was infected through, then just based on the IFR, that's just a calculated number, then 12.2 million people would die. Right? So that's our sort of just an image of what the type of fatalities we would naturally expect from a virus that has an IFR of 0.19, and that is endemic and reaches everybody, right? That's just a mathematical calculation, nothing more, right? A theoretical value, but that's the value that in our concept, in our model, we are moving towards, right? And you can see, and that's COVID fatality. So that does not include collateral damage, right? And fatalities from other reasons, like, oh, someone died because there was no hospital bed available for them because it was occupied by some COVID patient, right? That kind of case. Or, people commit suicide, right, because of the policy or other things, right? That may be related to COVID, but they're not pneumonia, okay? There's something else. So these are pneumonia, if you like, pneumonia fatalities. Pneumonia triggered by SARS-CoV-2. Not other pneumonias; those I don't count, obviously, right? So, so for the COVID fatalities, we are now. The model says we are now at 7.4 million. Reported fatalities are 2.84 as of today. So the factor of actual fatalities over reported is still 2.6 in my model. So that hasn't really changed. But the 82% are. The 7.4 million COVID fatalities are now accounting for 82% of all excess fatalities, whereas last month that figure was a little bit lower. So what happened is that the COVID fatalities are exactly on the trend line that I had predicted last month, but the excess fatalities have come down a bit, and that's simply because I've taken some new data. I've now relied a lot on The Economist, which has been tracking excess fatality for some time, and they have included more and more countries. They now have most of the countries I'm looking at, not all, about 80% of the countries I'm looking at. So for those 80% to be consistent, I've now just simply accepted The Economist data. Remember last time I told you, I have multiple sources for different countries, and often they're not compatible, and then I just go and do an average, or because I don't really know which source is more reliable, right? And so on, and it's complicated, right? And so now I've simplified it by saying, okay, I don't even know the sources of The Economist. And obviously, for each country, they will have the source, right? But I don't even know what they are. They're probably, typically, they're government agencies. But whatever, right? I'm just taking, to keep it simple, I take The Economist data for all the countries that they cover, I take their data. And then for the remaining countries that they don't cover, I use my other sources, right? So it's not totally consistent, but it's a bit more consistent than before. And what I found there is there are quite a few countries which I previously had a fairly significant excess mortality factor, where in the Economist data, there really isn't much of an excess fatality beyond, the COVID fatalities that have been registered. Right? In fact, there are some countries where in 2020, excess fatalities went down rather than up. right? So even though they have some COVID deaths, that number is relatively minor compared to some other effects. And some of these effects have nothing to do with COVID at all. They're just fluctuations every year, different things. And maybe last year the influenza season was mild. 2 years ago, remember, influenza was a very heavy influenza season. Tens of thousands of people died of influenza. It's just that we don't talk about that normally. Actually, some years maybe influenza is a bigger problem than COVID, right? Maybe soon we will be in that situation, but influenza we just don't talk about because it's not new. Right? But 2 years ago, we had some countries had really significant influenza fatalities, and then last year, luckily, they didn't, and so that reduces, the mortality, right? And that's a negative excess mortality, right? Has maybe nothing to do with COVID. It's just independent of it, maybe. But it just happens in the statistics that countries have COVID fatalities, but nevertheless, the total fatalities in that year are actually down and not up. So there are negative excess fatalities, if you like, relative to the average of the previous 3 or 5 years. Right? That happens, and there are also countries where you have some things where you say, oh, that's maybe an immediate effect of the COVID policies, for example. For example, some countries reporting significantly lower traffic accidents and fatalities from traffic accidents. Some countries like Thailand, for example, have significant fatalities from traffic accidents in a normal year. Last year, because of all these shutdowns and policies and restrictions, there were fewer. So COVID has saved lives, or rather the policy has saved lives, but not so much on the COVID front. They've saved lives elsewhere. If people are not allowed to go out, they cannot possibly get into a traffic accident, right? So so you have counter effects. Now, if you really wanted to do a demographic analysis of what happened in 2020 around in the sort of COVID year and also this year, you would also have to take into account birth. There are now some data and studies appearing that say, well, significant, the shutdowns and other policies and social distancing, etc., have had significant impact on birth. It doesn't only affect fatalities, it also affects birth, right? And it affects birth differently in different places. So I saw, for example, Indonesia and the Philippines reporting significant increases in birth rates. People stay at home, nothing to do, maybe can't get to the pharmacy where they could buy their contraceptives. Babies get produced. So COVID policies in some countries may have driven up birth rates. Now, that's not universally the case. It's the case in some countries like Indonesia and the Philippines. There are also other countries, for example, the EU, the US, China, and Singapore, to name a few that I found data, and I'm sure there are others. South Korea also reported the lowest birth rates ever, I think, last year, if I'm not mistaken. So in some countries, there seems to have been a negative effect on birth rates. For example, one article about the US said there's a history in the US, whenever unemployment goes up, birth rates go down because of uncertainty and insecurity of people. They postpone birth. It's plausible, right? So in some countries, psychologically, this kind of a crisis which feeds into employment levels going down has a negative effect on birth. People delay. In other countries, like in Indonesia or the Philippines, it has a positive effect on birth rate. So to get a global picture, we would have to sum it all up, right? Which I haven't seen any data on that yet. It's probably a bit too early, but eventually someone will go and sum it all up and say, oh, net, either the COVID policies increase global birth or reduce global birth. At the moment, I think it looks like reduced global birth, right? If you're a little bit cynical like me, then you could even say that's actually a good thing, right? We have way too many humans on this planet, so we need lower birth rates urgently. And yes, they have been trending down for some time, but they can trend down even more. That's great. However, the same cynic would then say, oh, that means an ever bigger proportion of population will be above 65, and bingo, we will have more troubles in the future with new viruses, right? So it's going to get ever worse because we're getting ever older on average, but at the same time, we have too many of us. So therefore, it's good that the birth rates go down if that's what happened last year. So I think I'm just trying to say I've been tracking these excess fatalities, arguing that a lot of these excess fatalities will, if not directly, then indirectly relate to COVID. Not COVID, just not the illness per se, but also the policies around it, right? That's why I've been tracking it. And then last month I started to say, no, I have to separate out the COVID ones from the others, because it's only the COVID fatalities that drive my IFR and my infection ratio, right? The others, they are there and they're noteworthy, but they don't drive anything in my model. So that's why up to last month, my model was in that respect a bit too simplistic. And last month I said, okay, I know that it's too simplistic and I'm gonna separate it out, right? That was one of the factors that drove the, on the previous slide, you saw the curve going down in the month of 1st of March. Partially because I divvied out the immediate COVID deaths from other excess deaths, and it's only the immediate COVID deaths that drive the infection rate, right? So this is more precise. Yeah, but I'm still showing you the blue curve, which is the total excess fatalities. Just simply saying, well, some of those excess fatalities are due to government policies and mistakes made and unintended side effects and consequences and so on, and it's noteworthy tracking them. But if I was really fair, I would then have to say, well, then I would also have to track the excess or negative excess in birth as well, right? So I'm not planning to do that, but I'm acknowledging that here there's a bit sort of a bias in here by saying, oh, I'm closely tracking the excess fatalities and pointing at governments for all the mistakes they made. But if I was fair, I would then also have to track the delta in birth relative to normal years, right? And whether it's up or down. And then of course, one could then get into an argument, well, what does it mean? If the births are up, is that good or bad? If the births are down, is that good or bad, right? It's almost in the eye of the beholder. So that would get us too far away from talking about COVID, I think. So I'm going to continue tracking the excess mortalities as I'm doing here, because it's built into the model. I'm not going to take it out now. That would be a lot of work. I could, but no need for that. But the main figure for us to look at is the 7.39. That's the main, and not the 9.1. Right? And it's the 7.39 that you can put into relation to the 12.2 in the header. Right? The 12.2 is sort of the target. If everybody has been exposed to the virus and the IFR stays at 0.19, then at the end of the day, we would expect 12.2 million deaths. And we are now at 7.4, so about 60% there, right? That's sort of the main point here. Okay. Going on, looking at global data again. One of the things I think is striking, and I want to trace closely going forward, is what I call decoupling. I've already mentioned that there are some individual countries where I've observed, because they've reached herd immunity in a natural way, their fatalities are no longer going up, even when their cases go up. Yeah? Cases can go up or down in relation to seasons and other factors, but the fatalities will tend to stay low, as I explained. So that I call that decoupling, right? Up to about a month or two ago, we didn't really see that. We normally saw fatalities tracking cases, not super closely, but remember, cases are driven primarily by how much testing you do, and if countries increase their testing, then these numbers go up, right? Even though the underlying activity didn't go up, right? Just because more are being discovered through the testing. So you raise testing, you raise the curve, right? Well, last time I talked about exponential curves. They don't really exist because what you see is actually an exponential rollout of testing, right? Especially the early stage. Anyways, there was a relatively close mirroring of fatalities and cases. In the moment where you hit herd immunity, you expect that to end. And I call that decoupling, right? The cases can go up or down depending on various factors because people get reinfected again and again. So the cases, even if everybody has been exposed, they can be exposed again and they may show up in the figures again because they get tested and they're positive. Doesn't mean anything to their health, but they are positive. The test only tests whether you're positive. The test doesn't test whether it means anything. You know, that's the problem with these testing campaigns that go on. I've said on another occasion, this is completely crazy, all this testing. Yeah, this is completely needless and pointless and has no value. Why? Because all you find out is, oh, someone is positive or negative, but it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you anything about whether the person will get sick or not, right? That you have to see whether they have symptoms or not. That is the relevant factor, not whether they tested positive. Anyways, but you know, so we are doing what we're doing. So we're testing a lot. So we have a lot of testing data. They detect cases, and they will continue detecting cases. And they cannot distinguish. The test at the moment cannot distinguish whether this is your first infection or you already repeat infection, right? And over the years, we will have these infections again and again and again. And if you get tested, it will be picked up. It means nothing to your health, probably, but you will, you know, nevertheless be tested positive, right? Whatever, it means something to the policymakers, but not to your health. Yeah, so the number of cases can go up or down, but if there's herd immunity in my definition, the fatalities will no longer go up, or only very modestly when you have like a big seasonal wave. Okay, they may go up a little bit, but you know, basically they will be flat and trending slowly down towards zero. So that's decoupling. Now, two things can drive decoupling: either natural herd immunity or vaccination-induced herd immunity. Right? It doesn't even have to be herd immunity. Just if you vaccinate those people who really at risk, so as I said, globally maybe that's 15% or so of the population, and in some countries like Germany maybe that's 25 or 30%. You know, in other countries maybe it's 20%. You know, but whatever that fraction of the population that by our definition is at risk, if you vaccinate them all, that gives you basically 100% herd immunity. You don't have to vaccinate, as I said earlier, jokingly about Mr. What's his name? That you don't have to vaccinate children at all, right? Because they have anyways zero fatalities, whether you vaccinate them or not. Right? So, so that you don't need to create herd immunity overall in the population with your vaccination. There's no need for it, although all the governments are now doing it, as we had anticipated. It's irrational, but that's exactly what we expected. This irrationality, right? We are starting to be able to think like irrational people do and anticipate what they're going to do. Yeah, so irrationally, we are now going to all aim for herd immunity on the entire population. Actually, all you need is vaccinate those at risk, and then that's it, right? You're done. And that is the equivalent of 100% herd immunity, because nobody will die, or nobody will have severe symptoms. Okay. In other words, with some countries, as I said, now reaching natural herd immunity, and with some countries such as the US, UK, and Chile, with their current programs getting very close to reaching that, what I call herd immunity among those who need it, right? The risk groups, you will have two sets of countries, significant countries, that basically will no longer see rising fatalities. They can only see like fatalities trending down for good until they reach zero, right? So with more and more countries being in one of those two categories, so the first category, natural herd immunity, I have Iran, South Africa, Mexico. Since then, since last time, remember I said I would go through the list and see whether I can identify some others. So Peru, apparently, New York State. So it's interesting, big country like US, not all states are on the same level, right? Remember, the New England states were sort of the first to be hit last year in April, May, and had significant fatalities and infection activity then, meaning, you know, most people by now will have been exposed. And when you look at the New York data, you're starting to see a decoupling effect indeed. And I presume in the case of New York and maybe a few other New England states, the smaller ones, I haven't looked at them, but I imagine it's similar, that they have actually reached natural herd immunity. They're starting, of course, with vaccination, and that will add to it. But my sense is New York was sort of still was so quick to get to natural herd immunity that they almost didn't need the vaccinations anymore. That's not quite true, right? As I said before, even countries that herd immunity should still apply the vaccinations to at-risk people, right? Because there will still be some portion of them who have not been exposed, for sure, and they benefit from the vaccine. So let me repeat that here to be very clear, right? Even when you have natural herd immunity, you should still apply the vaccinations to all those people in the at-risk group, because some of them will not have been exposed, even though you're at 80%. 80% is not 100%. Huh? So New York, it seems to me, probably reached 80% penetration before the vaccinations really started hitting. But most of the rest of the United States did not yet, because most other states outside the New England states are running, a few months behind. And therefore, and because the US rollout is so quick, the vaccination impact will outflank and override the natural progression. Yeah. And you almost crowd out the natural progression, because again, if you vaccinate a lot of people, then you will slow down the natural progression. And at the same time, you start creating herd immunity in the at-risk group where it's needed. And basically, you are done, and you never had to reach natural herd immunity because you were so quick with your vaccinations. You crowded that out, right? So that's the case probably in most of the United States, outside New York State, and that's probably the case in most of the UK, probably the case in Chile, and maybe some other countries coming soon where we see now accelerating vaccination. So, two sets of countries where you could potentially see still growing infections, but declining fatalities. And that would suggest, since those are significant countries and they're becoming more and more as we go along, you would expect on the global level, when you look at the global data, to start seeing a global decoupling. Yeah. In some countries, not yet, but some countries are going ahead and starting to have that decoupling. And it should start showing in the aggregate data on the global level. Okay, so I'm looking at these, I'm using the worldometer graphics here. So what we saw in terms of cases on the left, we had a trough on the 20th of February, the low point after the heavy sort of winter activity. Remember, there were a lot of lockdowns in European countries, also parts of the US and elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, so that drove numbers down. Then there was a loosening up again, numbers coming back up. In the meantime, also numbers coming back up in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and some other places. So you see the low point on the 20th of February, and since then a fairly steep, increasingly steep rise in cases again. If you look at the corresponding reported fatalities on the right, you see that their low point was on the 13th of March. So it's about 3 weeks after the low point on the left, which is, exactly what you would expect. I always say, it's depending on the country and circumstances, somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks is the delay between an infection being registered and the fatality that comes with it being registered. Okay, so typically there is that delay of 2 to 4 weeks in the fatalities, and that's what you see here. So about 3 weeks. So that's as expected, and then now it's coming up again. Now the question here is it going to come up as steeply as on the left? Right? And it's too early to tell. When you look at it visually, you might say, yeah, the curve on the right, it seems it's coming up more slowly compared to the curve on the curves are the 7-day moving average curves, right? So the curve on the right is the 7-day moving average of fatalities, and that seems to be coming up more slowly than the case, seven-day moving average of cases on the left. Yes, but if you're honest, you could, for example, see that initially after the 20th of February, the curve on the left was also slow, and then it accelerates. So we may, in the fatalities, we may just have to wait another week or two, and then we see that too, right? So it's, or we may not. That's the question, right? So it's too early even to try to eyeball anything here. It's too early, but conceptually, that's what we expect. Yeah, we expect a decoupling. Add to that, as I said before, we are now reaching the end of the season, or with some delay, maybe within the next couple of weeks, we will be reaching the end of the season in the northern hemisphere. And since the majority of the global population live in the northern hemisphere, as opposed to the southern hemisphere, naturally, that will mean a bigger proportion of cases will come from the south or from tropics. And those countries are often, not always, but often countries with intrinsically lower IFRs because significantly younger populations. Right? So you're bound to see some replacement of high IFR countries' activity by low IFR country activity. Right? So that's a third factor, in addition to the two herd immunity drivers that I explained, that could also lead to decoupling. Yeah, because in those lower IFR countries that are now coming to the fore, cases may go up, but fatalities also go up, but they go up more slowly because their IFR is lower. Yeah, so those three factors down there, they can all, they would all suggest that we ought to be seeing a decoupling in the next weeks to come. Too early to tell, but I'm just telling you I'm going to watch this space, okay? Okay. So to sum it up, why am I saying the severity of COVID-19 is trending towards insignificant? Let me put some stakes in the ground to be very clear. Number of people killed by the virus, SARS-CoV-2, 0. As I said before, the virus doesn't kill anybody. Number of people killed by their compromised immune systems, 7.4 million. That's what we normally call them COVID fatalities. But what precipitates their death is their immune system misbehaving. Too slow to prevent the virus from getting into the lung. Once it's in the lung, not clearing the lung properly, overreacting, blah, 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 and fatality follows. Yeah? Just to be clear about the logic. It's not that the virus has absolutely nothing to do with it. The virus triggers the whole thing, but that's it. It's the immune system that's the problem, not the virus. I keep saying that, and I say that again. Our compromised immune systems have killed 7.4 million people in the last 13 months. Number of people expected to be killed by their compromised immune systems, 12.2 million. That's the calculated figure I talked about, right? So meaning that what we have reached now, 7.4, is about 61% of the target. So naturally, we've gotten to about 60%. Right? Now the vaccines are starting to hit. They will reduce this number, the 12.2. They will drive that number down. How they will drive it down, how quickly, that's at the moment still difficult to say. We'll have to see how the programs are being rolled out, how aggressively, etc. On current trends of vaccination rollout, they will drive down that number quite quickly. So the number on the left, the 7.4 million, will keep going up, but as I said earlier, the curve is flattening, so the increase will gradually be less and less. And at the same time, the number on the right, the 12.2, will come down. Thanks to vaccinations, we will never reach 12.2. Yeah. And somewhere in between, they will meet those two numbers, and then we are done. Yeah. And if, let's say, they meet at 9, let's say, in a few months' time, they meet at 9, meaning we reach 9 million deaths and then no more, or almost no more. I mean, so small that we don't count it. Then we would be in a position to say, okay, we had 9 million fatalities out of 12.2 expected fatalities. So vaccinations have saved 3.2 million lives. That would be a fairly reasonable thing to then say, if those numbers pan out that way, right? Now, some governments will then, but by our lockdowns, at least at the tail end of the, meaning right now the lockdowns, they also save lives because they keep the left number low and therefore allow the vaccines, give the vaccines a bigger window of reducing the number on the right. So instead of meeting at 9, maybe we meet at 8.7. Then in addition to whatever the vaccines would have saved anyways, then there's another 0.3 million where governments would say, those we saved through our lockdowns that we did in February, March, April. And that might then be actually correct, right? I think I said before, normally these lockdowns are completely useless. In fact, they can be counterproductive because they potentially drive the number on the far right. I'm coming to that number in a moment. But at this stage where we know we have the vaccines and we are ready to roll them out, we're in the process of rolling them out. If you now delay infections by locking people up, you would actually expect some measurable impact on lives because you simply hold back the death until the vaccines are there, right? So that would actually, it would widen the window in which the vaccines have an impact. Yeah, I'm not an advocate of lockdowns, as you know, and I'm not changing my mind on that because I think they're completely illegal and inhuman. You can only do these things on a voluntary basis, which we could have done. And we could have said to people, look, you are at risk, please behave like this. We could have done all of that, right? But we didn't, okay. But at least if the governments now come and say, but those final lockdowns we did in February, March, April, they did save some lives, then they would probably be correct. Yeah, that's logical anyways. Yeah, I'm just saying that so that you don't think I'm hiding anything, right? I'm very critical of lockdowns, but the fact of the matter is once you have vaccines on the horizon and it's just a matter of getting them to the people and fast enough and producing them, etc., then there is some logic to having a holdback of cases, which a logic that didn't really exist before. Yeah. Anyways, we'll see, or maybe we won't see because we will not have really accurate numbers to really make judgments in the end. What exactly saved how many lives and didn't save how many lives and killed how many additional lives, we will never really know, right? But I think what's clear and what will be visible and measurable is that the vaccines will allow us to stop well short of 12.2 million fatalities. And the 12.2 million are calculated based on an IFR of 0.19 now. That just assumes that my IFR assumption is correct. It, of course, may not be correct. The IFR in reality may be higher or lower, right? I always said I'm trying to be conservative. So if anything, I believe it's rather going to be lower than higher, meaning if it was lower, then the 12.2 would be a bit too high and the actual target number would be a little bit less than that. But, at the moment, I'm comfortable with my 0.19 and I have no reason to change it. And so I'm not, right? I'm not going to change it now. And now that the vaccines are coming, it will be impossible for me to divvy out the natural decline in IFR. Remember early on I said the IFR will tend to trend down because we get better at treatments. And there are various factors. I talked about that at length in some other talk. So there is a tendency for the IFR to go down. Then I said, well, eventually if governments keep us away from the virus for too long, the IFR will go back up, right? Because we're all getting older and therefore more susceptible to severe disease. But I think all of that will be overridden by the vaccines coming on so quickly and being so effective. So I don't really expect to change my IFR from now on. because if I was to say, oh, I want to trend it down, I would be like, but I can't know whether all the positive things we are seeing are just due to the vaccines, right? And not any other effect. Clearly, the vaccines will drive down the IFR towards zero, right? There may also be a natural decline, but compared to the impact that the vaccines are going to have going forward, that natural decline will be quite minute. And it will be impossible to know what it is, right? And so purely conceptually, I would say, yeah, I think if anything, it will continue trending down a little bit probably, but that's very iffy. So the safest in terms of being conservative is my assumption is probably to say I'm going to lock in the 0.19 probably. Let's see. I mean, I may still change my mind on that, but at the moment I would say I'll probably not change that anymore. So therefore, since that drives the 12.2 million, the 12.2 million will be locked in. That's the target number of fatalities if we didn't have the vaccines. Okay? And then we can, in due course, maybe by the end of this year or so, at some point, or maybe early next year, we can take stock. And we can say, okay, where did we actually end up in terms of fatalities? Right? And as I said, if that number, let's say, turns out to be 9 or 10, then we can say, okay, the gap between 12.2 and whatever that number is, that's really net saved lives. Saved life. I don't like that term, and it's not well defined, but I talked about that before too, so I don't want to repeat that. But yeah, there will be a measurable, visible, positive impact of the vaccines in these numbers. That's obviously the case, right? Obviously, we all expect that, and yes, definitely the numbers will also show that. And the numbers will give you some sense, how big was that impact that the vaccines brought us. And significant. As I said before, the one positive thing that came out of this whole affair is, the vaccines. Okay, the figure on the right is simply, remember on the previous chart I said excess fatalities, 9 point something, and then COVID fatalities, 7.4, and the difference between the two is 1.7 million. So there are 1.7 million unexplained excess fatalities in the world last year. Whether that number is really correct, I mean, I've always been saying these excess fatality numbers are very iffy. Some countries don't publish them. For some countries, there are multiple sources and they are very diverse. So they're not very compatible. So what do you do, right? Do you average them, or how do you pick one? You don't know which study is more reliable than the other, right? Very tricky. So this 1.7 million is very iffy, but there is a sense here that, having said all of the above, there will have been some significant number of people who died, not directly of pneumonia, but of some effect or other related to COVID, and especially related to the policies of governments. Some significant number within that 1.7 million will be people that have effectively been killed by their governments. And it's going to be very hard to know what that number is, and you will never be able to bring someone to court and say you murdered these people, because it will be way too hazy. Yeah, but I don't want to drop this under the table either. Right? The government policies of the last 13 months, and they're still continuing this year, and they will continue even into next year, and who knows how long, have had a net effect on killing some people. Whether or not, on the other hand, they've saved some people by delaying, the infections and therefore opening a window to be vaccinated, that remains to be seen. And the answer may be yes, to some degree, probably. But it may well be that this figure here on the right, the 1.7 million, and it's not all government, murders. It's maybe some other things in there as well, right? Random things, right? But some subset of the 1.7 million, there are significant numbers of people who were killed by the governments, and that number may be bigger than whatever we end up saving on the left, not counting the savings from vaccines. So, only counting those that are, saved from vaccines because of government policy. And vaccines are not government policy. Government is actually slowing down vaccines in many countries, or applying them to the wrong people who don't need them. Remember, I talked about that as well, right? So governments are not being very helpful in the vaccination, right? If you left this to a bunch of, I don't know, private enterprise, you probably would have a better vaccination rollout, right? So even there, maybe governments are killing further people by being just completely unorganized around the vaccination rollout, right? I mean, some countries have barely started, and even those countries who are rich and have ordered many, they have operational issues with getting the vaccine to the people. I mean, it's mind-boggling, yeah? So it's not as if the governments are the ones who are driving this vaccination. It was private enterprise that created these vaccines, and if you left the administration of the vaccines to private enterprise, and you allowed them to apply them to those people who actually need them, and not to all kinds of other cronies of ministers or whatnot, we actually would be better off, right? So don't think that the governments now are all of a sudden doing a great job. Yeah, in some places, the US, the UK, they are doing, on the vaccine front, they are doing their job well. Yeah, for a change. But if they left that to private enterprise, it would be even better, probably. But at least in some countries, governments are a smaller drag than in other countries. There are some countries where the governments say, they're so arrogant and say, oh, we have the virus under control, so we don't need to vaccinate aggressively. We have time, because in their countries, people have zero rights, right? So the idea that they should free them up doesn't even arrive to those politicians, and they say, well, we have the virus under control. Meaning we are treating our people like cattle, right? But they're not dying. In a lot of countries, the only KPI they measure apparently is fatalities. Right? That's the only thing they care about. They don't have a KPI for upholding the constitution, upholding basic rights, upholding the law. None of those are KPIs for governments. Right? Only number of fatalities, very low. See, we're doing our job, great. And vaccine, no urgency, because there's nobody dying anyways. You can just keep going like this forever. Lockdown, people can't move, people have to wear masks, people social distancing. This is not allowed, this is not allowed, this is not allowed. This is not, we just leave it like that. There are governments like that. They're not even trying to roll out vaccines. Well, partially, as I said before, because they love the control it gives them, right? It's even easier now for them to control the people in the country, right? And exert power, and that's what politicians ultimately want, right? So enough of that, but yeah, so don't think that this is so straightforward and that you can say, oh yeah, but the vaccines, that's really kudos to the governments, they did the right thing. Yeah, kind of wishy, yeah, in some places, but it could have been a lot better. But it's still positive. I mean, to put a positive spin on it, yes, the vaccines are there, they are working fantastically well. And yes, they are often not administered to the people who really need them, but on the whole, they are, those people who need them are also among those who are being vaccinated, even if they're not prioritized. So eventually it will reach the people who need it, yes. And yes, even though it's slow, it will still save a couple of million of people from dying. Yeah. For all the lack of competence in the government, they can't prevent the vaccines from doing their job. Yeah. So we will be saving some lives here, but we will also, on the far right, we will have some unexplained excess fatalities, that many of which will be linked in some way or another to government policy. So these are people murdered by their own governments through misplaced, misconceived policies. So this is my dashboard here for tracking, what's going on in COVID. Okay. Moving on from there. So that was one axis of the scenarios. Remember, what's the horizontal axis? What's the severity of COVID, trending towards insignificant? The second axis, the vertical, what's the effectiveness of the global response? And I'm saying it's trending towards disastrous. And why are we saying that? Well, the percentage of humanity taken hostage in a state of exception, I just now put 99%. everybody is basically taken hostage now. 1% of us actually have a problem with the virus. The other 99% are being taken hostage. And are put into a state of exception for which there's no reason whatsoever. That's disastrous. How many man-years have been severely disrupted? Well, last year it was maybe 7.4 billion or so, because remember, it only really started in March in Wuhan and China, maybe a bit earlier. So by the end of this year, it will probably be 14 billion. There may be some people in the world who would say, "Oh, I'm not really affected." Yeah, but these numbers are quite meaningless, actually, right? I mean, just making them up. But it's just to say, because some people were talking about how they're saving lives, and the average lifespan is, of people who are severely ill is still, statistically 8 years, and if we can save their life, that's 8 man-years saved. Yeah. So so remember, this is long ago in the early stage, people were making those calculations, and I then made the counter calculation and said, well, every one of us has by now had 13 months of their lives destroyed. And there's 7.8 billion of us, right? So by the end of this year, it will be 14 billion man-years that have been severely disrupted, not entirely destroyed, but severely disrupted, terrorized by our governments. Right? I mean, that has to be said, right? There is no sense of proportion between, maybe we've saved a couple of million people at the end, as I said on the previous slide. Maybe we will find, primarily thanks to the vaccines, yes, we have saved a couple of million people. Yeah, but the cost of what we're doing is just, it's like on a different planet, on a much bigger planet. Economic costs, same, right? Last year, $7 trillion, and according to IMF, going over a 5-year span will be $22 trillion destroyed for no reason. And the state of exception that we're in, it may become indefinite, right? If you talk about those vaccination passports and those health plans, and I mean, some of these new regulations, once they're introduced into, for example, border crossings, they may never go away again. I keep saying that, but remember 9/11, ever since 9/11, we have those security things at airports, right? Not at other places, only at airports, but yeah, we do, right? And they never go, even though they're completely useless, because how often does a flight get grounded by terrorists? Like once every 10 years, a few hundred people. I mean, if we took those billions of dollars that cost, that scheme, and eradicated tuberculosis, which could easily be done, I think, with those few $1 billion that we're wasting every year, then we would save millions of lives instead of a few hundred. There's no proportion. That's what I'm saying. There's absolutely no proportion to that, right? In terms of the costs by so much outweigh the benefits. This is mind-boggling. This is a different dimension, right? Different order of magnitude. And the same here, right? Whatever if the government think there is some benefit to what they do, and by and large, I think there isn't any, but the cost of what they do is just mind-boggling. And one of the costs is that once you've got a state of exception going, you may just keep it indefinitely. And not only in countries that are totalitarian or authoritarian. Those, of course, they've had some of this state of exception before, right? And they're using COVID just to deepen that, right? But even countries where you would not have thought that they're totalitarian, I mean, Western so-called democracies, they're becoming more totalitarian by the day now, right? So the biggest cost of this whole affair in the end may actually just be that democracy has been abolished and individual freedom has been abolished for good, never to return. How do you measure that kind of cost in relation to some perceived benefit that is not even clear whether there's any benefit from these policies? But the cost could be unmeasurable and indefinite in terms of the duration. That's what I'm tracking here, right? Okay, that brings me to the point about global divergence. Remember, we are saying in the scenarios we are in the fractured world, and one element of that fracturedness of the world is that we have these multi-speed nation states that do very different things at very different speeds, and therefore, instead of having one global response that would all of us hang together, get through it, get done, we would already by now be done if we had done that. Instead, we've chosen to fragment our response into 200 little nation states, and within some of the nation states into their sub organizational levels. And therefore, we have a mosaic of ever more divergent countries and places, and ever fewer points of compatibility between them, which will make the mobility of global mobility of people ever harder in the future. It was already hard enough before COVID. Now it's going to be all but impossible to move around freely. So we've just lost that freedom to move completely, just because it is so diverse, and countries will be on such diverse timelines. So remember, I bucketed the countries I'm tracking into 4 buckets. I've added a few countries again, so the list is getting longer. I've added Peru, which is already at herd immunity. I've added Turkey, which is still far from herd immunity. I've added Egypt because I was looking for African countries. I had previously only South Africa. South Africa is at herd immunity, but it's not really representative of Africa. It's got different demographics, higher income levels than most of Africa. I was desperately looking for some, sub-Saharan African country where I could get some excess mortality data. I couldn't find any. Like big countries like Ethiopia or Nigeria, so it would be really nice to have in the model, but there's just no data. So I still don't have them, but I found Egypt. So Egypt, I have some mortality figures. So I included Egypt, and you can see Egypt is fairly high in terms of penetration, but now moving quite slowly. Yeah, those are the newbies, I guess. On Japan, South Korea, Thailand, I said earlier, I'm now using the excess mortality figures from The Economist, and those countries all have very modest excess mortality figures in The Economist, less than what I had previously in my model. I've accepted that. So just to let you know, so therefore now Japan, South Korea, and Thailand, the numbers are again quite a bit lower than they were in the previous version. Not that it makes a huge difference, because they're anyways hundreds of months away from herd immunity, no matter how you turn it. So it doesn't really make a big difference. But their penetration levels, if these numbers that I'm using now are correct, and I really wonder whether these countries are tracking their fatalities properly or not, or whether the sources are reliable. I really wonder. I don't really trust these numbers very much, but just to be consistent now, I'm using those numbers from The Economist. There I have them. And so I'm using them for Japan, Korea, and Thailand, and they tell us the fatality is low. There you go. So the penetration, therefore, is also low. Interestingly, even in the rich countries like Japan and South Korea, the vaccination is also slow. So, there are these countries that I described earlier. They think they have the virus so much under control, and they have found a way, a modus operandi that apparently the population is agreeable to, whatever it involves in restrictions, that they're not even in any rush to get vaccines rolled out. Right? But it just means they will keep those countries closed for a long time to come. This is not new. I've always said that about the new normal countries, that they will be the last to open their borders. But you can see now, if you look at those very low penetration figures, if they are correct, and then you look at the very low vaccination figures, the second column here now, this is new. I've added a new dimension, which is I'm now tracking the vaccinations. I'm using primarily CNN data. There are various Bloomberg, New York Times. There was various sources of tracking the vaccination figures, but I'm using what you see here is CNN because they suited me the way they display those numbers. And those numbers are probably more accurate than my infection rate calculations, right? But they add that second dimension. As I said, the IR, the infection ratio, tells you about how far away are we from natural herd immunity, and the vaccination rate tells you, well, how quickly are we going to close that gap and reach herd immunity at the level of those people who need it faster than we would naturally, right? That's why the second column now becomes really important, right? So what you see for the new normal countries, they are low on natural herd immunity and they are low on vaccine-induced herd immunity. They're just in a sort of they're frozen in a state where they have found a social distancing mechanism that they think they can sustain forever. Not forever, but for many, many months to come. These are months, right? Hundreds of months, meaning tens of years, right? At current numbers. Now, mind you, all of them will start ramping up their vaccinations, I'm sure. And also, as I say, I don't really believe in some of those numbers on the left. They seem very low. I have my doubts about these numbers, okay? But, I think they're probably higher. But I just don't have the evidence for that. It's just a hunch. So whatever. I mean, these numbers on the right, months to reaching herd immunity, and you see in some of the cases several hundred months. These numbers will come down, especially because even these countries will start rolling out vaccines. But it is interesting that the new normal countries will be the last to roll out vaccines, just because they have this sort of government arrogance, or maybe it is that the citizens don't want it any other way, I don't know, but say, no, we are happy to be in this permanent state of exception. It does mean they will not open their border in any meaningful way for a long time to come. We talked about Thailand and made jokes about their yacht quarantine program. Yeah, they will have, Hong Kong and Singapore are once again debating a sort of what they call a travel bubble, right? So 2 locations out of, 1,000 of possible locations, like 2 locations who have similar infection levels or whatnot and similar measures in place may agree to say, if you travel from that place to me, or from me to your place, and not any other third place, and you have certain characteristics, plus you do the test anyway, then maybe we will forfeit the quarantine. I mean, there's very, very, very limited measures, tiny baby steps of opening up that are so slow and so minute, they almost don't matter, right? They're probably more there just to tell the population we're doing something, rather than doing something real, right? Which would be, we open up, boom. They will certainly not do that. So these new normal countries will be closed for many years, perhaps. It hits me personally because, as I said, I'm half Thai now. It hits me very hard, but that's the reality of what we're facing. Yeah, I'm based in Asia, and the new normal countries are almost all Asian countries. They just will be, there's a different kind of decoupling going on here. They're decoupling from the rest of the world. The back to normal and to some degree the muddle through countries will find a way to open up again. I'm quite positive with some terror mechanisms that they will impose on international travelers. As I said before, they always like to hit down on international travelers, as if the virus is somehow more frightening if it's an international traveler's virus. Right? It's complete nonsense, but yeah, they will all, symbolically hit hard on the international travelers, people like me, yeah, but they will find some kind of opening. The new normal, they may not. They are almost embracing this virus that is becoming insignificant as a pretext to locking themselves up. Maybe they always wanted that anyways. Maybe they were never comfortable with opening. Right? Maybe it just suits them. I don't know. But that's what we're seeing in this data. Right? So Sweden, as you know, I called it normal just because they didn't hammer down on their people and primarily relied on individual responsibility and care for each other. Now they have had some measures since January or since December. They went a little bit away from their original plan, not because the government changed their mind, but because there was so much pressure. I predict there was so much pressure from people who don't understand what they're doing, which is the majority. Remember, the majority of voters don't understand this, right? The vast majority of voters don't understand this. So they will have piled pressure on the government to do what everybody else does, right? People are just more comfortable, no matter how stupid it is, just do it because everybody else does it, right? And the government did, I mean, they want to stay in power as well. Like in that sense, the Swedish government is no different than any other government. Okay, we have to give a bit, otherwise, we have a revolution. So they changed their tone a little bit. Yeah, we have to have some measures in place, but they are still quite modest, these measures. But so I think it's still worthwhile keeping them in that special category. Because they're the only country that from the beginning understood the virus and respected the constitution. Right? To some degree, as I said, the US and some other countries in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico also maybe fall in that category, but they may have a diversity of reactions depending on which state or province you're in, so it's a bit harder to say. But in Sweden, I think that has been fairly consistent, despite having now some measures in place at the moment. I would still keep Sweden in that special category. And for them, so what I'm now doing is I'm trying to calibrate the continued natural progression, which I said is overall is sort of still growing, but the growth is slowing down, right? Now we had 60%, and then maybe next month we had 63% or whatever, right? So it's going up, it's sloping up, but the slope is getting flatter and flatter. So we have that effect, and then you have much more steeply the vaccination effect coming up. And as I said, in some countries, the vaccinations are already now superseding the natural progression, namely in the UK and the US and in Chile. And over the next months or 2 or 3, we would expect several other countries here, mostly European countries, which are playing catch up now in terms of vaccinations, to also get to that point where the vaccination progression supersedes and almost crowds out the natural progression, right? So there's a kind of a strange multiplier effect between the two, but it's not a straightforward, simple formula, I think. But they're not perfectly additive. You cannot just say this percentage plus that percentage is, that's the total. So it's not quite like that. But I've tried to, and I didn't bring the formula. I could have maybe next time I show you the formula, just so you can see what I'm doing. But I've tried to combine the natural infection ratio and the vaccination ratio into a joint sort of driver of how long will it take that country to reach sort of functional herd immunity. And functional herd immunity is that those people at risk, and again, depending on which country you're in, that may range between 10% to 30% of the population, to get those herd immunized. Either, by a combination of some of them have already been naturally immunized and others are now being vaccinated on top, right? But not double count, right? If someone already had the virus and is now being vaccinated, the vaccination basically has no effect. Or, as I said before, it may have an effect in that if it's very targeted in terms of triggering your immune system to develop certain very effective neutralizing antibodies, the vaccine may even be more effective in protecting you in the future than the natural infection. It's possible. So I'm not denying that even someone who had the infection already might still benefit to some degree from getting a vaccine now on top. I'm not excluding that possibility that there is a net additional benefit, but I don't know how big that benefit is. And it's too complicated to try to model that. So I'm trying to avoid double counting. So if someone already is in the risk group and was already infected, then the vaccine doesn't, in my model, doesn't have an additional effect. But if they're at risk and they weren't yet infected, then the vaccine, of course, has 100% effect, right? So I'm trying to combine those two. I'm not sure I have found the right formula yet for that. I'm playing around with that, but the result is you get sort of a driver of how many months will it take that country to reach functional herd immunity, meaning 80% of those who need it have been immunized and basically are done. And here's very preliminary results, but here's what they are. For Sweden, it's 15 months at current rates. Now, mind you, whenever you use these kind of at current rate, it's very tricky, right? Already on the infection ratio, what I use is the last 7 days average, and then I just project that forward. But we know in some countries it's currently going steeply up, in other countries it's coming down. So last week's 7-day average may be very different from next week's 7-day average, and let alone 3 months from now, right? As we go into the summer season in the Northern Hemisphere, all those numbers will come down. As we go into the winter season in the Southern Hemisphere, in those countries, the numbers will come up, right? I mean, so to extrapolate from a 7-day average is, in a way, is almost meaningless. I'm honest, right? And the same, even more so, with the vaccination ratios, because many countries are only just starting to ramp up the vaccination programs. They're at an early stage, and they may well next week hit an inflection point where it shoots up, right? So the vaccination ratios in this table here are the current ones as per yesterday, total vaccinated, at least with one shot. So those are solid figures, but in these calculations for time to 80%, I'm using how much in vaccinations are they adding every week? And I'm using the last 7 days available, and I have a data source for that. How many shots did they administer in the last 7 days? And I'm extrapolating that and adding that. I'm taking the column here, so the current vaccinations as a base, and then taking the last 7-day average and extrapolate from the base out into the future. That's very iffy, okay. So for example, Sweden, I'm saying, they will still need 15 months to get to full, to herd immunity at the level where it's needed. I mean, it's bound to be too pessimistic, right? It's bound to go faster because Sweden is still in the ramp up, and they will accelerate their vaccination programs, as will all the European countries, right? So we do the same calculation again next month, and it's bound to be, this number is bound to already be quite a bit lower than 15 months, right? Okay, now that's just to be clear about what these numbers mean. They don't mean that much, but they give you, just since I'm using the same methodology for all countries, at least relatively speaking, they give you a feel for where are the different countries at in terms of their progression, right? So the back to normal countries, they're all either already at herd immunity naturally, and Russia is just about to hit herd immunity according to my model, and Mexico, South Africa, Iran, and Peru are already there, or they are not far away. Yeah. Now, US, as I said, because of the changes I made to the IFR calculation, including obesity and diabetes, that increased the IFR for the US, therefore reduced their infection ratio down to 50 and a bit. Last time I said it's almost 60. Now I'm saying it's just a bit over 50. So that's a big difference, right? So, so they're not near natural herd immunity, but they're ramping up a very quick vaccination program. So on current count, they will need 7.5 months to have all the people who need it vaccinated. But even that sounds a bit slow. I mean, from what you hear from Mr. Biden, for example, he says by July 4th, I want to have everybody vaccinated too, at least everybody who needs it, right? Plus quite a lot of people in addition to that. So that would be only 3 or 4 months. So which tells you maybe my formula isn't that great, but yeah. The US, whichever way you turn it, is not far away from being done. UK is even closer to it. That's primarily also because they are the only major country that has a different strategy of administering one shot first and getting at least all those who are at risk vaccinated once, and then administering the second shot only later. And because in my formula, only the first shot matters, because we know that even the first shot is already 70, 80% effective in preventing severe COVID. And so for me, that's already sort of, that's the one that counts more than the second. The second takes the effectiveness to above 90%, even 100% in some cases. I know that, and that's important, and I'm not saying you shouldn't get your second shot, right? But I'm just saying it is the first shot that has the biggest impact. And the UK were the ones who realized that and acted upon it. And that means their vaccination rate here of 45% is a lot higher than in the US, primarily because the US is using the more conventional approach of administering the second shot within the 3 or 4 week time span that the manufacturers are recommending. Whereas the UK isn't. Instead, they're using that second shot to give it as a first shot to another person. Right? So in the statistics, that favors the UK. I'm not really trying to make a judgment here whether the UK strategy is superior to the other strategies, because one thing we don't know is whether if they delay the second shot too much, maybe then the second shot is almost becoming worthless. It depends on how the immune system reacts to these shots, and that's something I don't know, and I haven't seen really good quality information on. So I'm holding my breath. You know, I think what the UK is doing is very effective in getting a high level of protection to as many people as possible very quickly. The others, with the more conventional strategy of administering 2 shots within the time frame that the manufacturers recommend, are running a bit behind in terms of that initial protection, which means at the moment the UK fatalities are way down, and more so than in the US even, right? And far more so than anywhere else in Europe. So you are seeing that effect of their strategy. So they are saving lives as we speak. Whether there are, however, some negative repercussions in the longer run, where, for example, a country like the US or the rest of Europe, if they administer the conventional way and that's maximum effectiveness, people get a great level of protection, and therefore you get to zero. It takes a little while, but you get to zero in terms of fatalities in the future, or near zero, right? Whereas in the UK, these people have been somewhat insulated, but not fully, if the second shot comes too late and isn't so effective. And I'm saying if, because I don't know yet whether that's the case. So they're taking a certain risk there, I think. So they're having a positive short-term effect. The question is, might they have a not so positive, a negative long-term effect? So that 10 months from now, the US fatalities or the German or French fatalities will be lower than the UK fatalities, because they did the administration of the vaccine in such a way as in line with what the manufacturers recommended, and the recommendations were based on their studies, right? Now, these studies had their own limitations. They didn't have a lot of time, whether they're really, I mean, the UK took a stance in that we take a bit of a risk here for long term. We don't know exactly what the impact of our strategy, but in the short term, surely it will save lives. And that's true. Right. So I'm not here to judge those different strategies. Almost all other countries, as far as I can see, are using the conventional strategy, but that doesn't mean they're right. That just because the herd moves like a herd doesn't mean it's moving in the right direction. It doesn't mean they're wrong either. I'm observing there are 2 strategies here. At the moment, it favors the UK, also in my numbers. But whether that's really the superior strategy in hindsight, 10 months from now, we will see. Chile and Brazil. So Chile is going to reach herd immunity fairly quickly as well, because they also have an aggressive vaccination rollout, and as well as having also fairly high natural immunization already, 50%. And Brazil, they have a fairly slow vaccination rollout, but they are rapidly moving towards natural herd immunity. So Brazil is also a case where probably the vaccination will be too slow to sort of catch up with the natural progression. So the vaccination in the end will not save a lot of lives in Brazil, because they got there on a natural progression first, meaning there are people dying, right? At the moment, the fatalities in Brazil are just peaking. I think the infections have just peaked in Brazil, probably just a few days ago. Remember, Mexico, they peaked at the end of January. Brazil, they peaked at the end, by the looks of it. It's a bit premature. I'll observe what's happening, but it looks like they just peaked just in the end of March. So you could say Brazil peaked just about 2 months after Mexico. So if Mexico is now at herd immunity, Brazil, by that measure, could be at herd immunity in 2 months' time. Why am I saying 5 months? Well, I'm not anticipating that fatalities in Brazil will remain this high. And I'm really anticipating that they will peak within the next 2-3 weeks and then probably come down quite a bit, even before they hit 80% penetration. Yeah, and their vaccination program at the moment isn't moving very fast, but that could change, right? Of course, if Brazil all of a sudden says, now we are stepping up the vaccinations and accelerating that, then that will accelerate this. They may be done in a matter of 2 or 3 months. Yeah, totally possible. But anyways, all of these back to normal countries, you can see they have a really, they're either already at herd immunity, and so therefore, like South Africa, Iran, Peru, they're very slow vaccination programs, but they could reasonably say, well, the vaccinations wouldn't have such a huge impact anyways, because we are already at natural herd immunity. Most of our old folks have already encountered the virus anyways, right? But yeah, there are still 20% or so who haven't, or 15 to 20%. And if they could accelerate their vaccination and get them to those people in a targeted way, they could still save lives. But their urgency may now be not as high, and it will be sort of okay because not so many people will die in those countries anymore. Anyways, yeah. So all these back to normal countries, either by natural herd immunity or by a combination of natural and vaccinated herd immunity, they will get there. They will get to the end where they basically have near zero fatalities within a matter of months. So they're not far away from it. That's why they're called back to normal, right? And I could see that already 6-7 months ago, although I did not anticipate necessarily that the countries are also quickest naturally will also be quickest on vaccinations. That's quite interesting. Yeah. But the name was back to normal was well put, right? They just really, they want to go back to normal, and they want to just get through this. They are not governments who want to linger within this state of emergency. Very different from the new normal countries. Yeah. Okay, muddle through countries, yeah, they're a bit of a mixed bag. You can see the European countries, they have, Italy has a pretty high penetration, and it's also doing reasonably well on the vaccination rollout. Now they have just announced another lockdown, so their number in the left-hand column, the IR, is not going to grow that fast in the next few weeks because of the lockdown, right? But maybe they're like the rest of Europe, they're trying to accelerate their vaccinations, and if they can handle that, then maybe we'll see a shortening of these periods here. But they are, at the moment, typically these countries are still 12 months in Europe, right? They're still 12 months or so away from being done, but I suspect they'll all try to accelerate that, and they'll all aim maybe by October, November, before Christmas anyways, to kind of be done. So they'll be a bit behind the back to normal countries, maybe by half a year behind, but they, there's probably some catch up that they can do. India and Indonesia, yeah, I have them in the muddle through because some of their policies are quite muddly, and they're now in India it's very diverse from state to state, very different. So it's very hard to say. The vaccination programs are slow. Both are saying we will accelerate our vaccination programs, so that may be the case. Both countries are difficult to actually administer vaccination drives, even if they have the will and they put their money behind it and so on. Logistically, etc., not easy, right? So these are muddled through countries where, for some time to come, the natural immunization will still be the dominant driver, right? And the vaccination will only slowly catch up with that. And the same in Egypt. Egypt actually already has a pretty high, according to the mortality figures that I got, already has a pretty high penetration, but that penetration is slow now, and the vaccination program is almost non-existent. So, yeah, so on those current figures, Egypt will, in terms of how many months to get through this, they are almost more like a new normal country. But they differ greatly from the new normal countries that they actually already have achieved a high natural penetration, just that penetration has slowed down for some reason. But that may be temporary. Maybe in the next few months or weeks, we'll see an acceleration again in Egypt of the of the activity of the virus. They are like a desert country with their own climatic conditions. There, it's very hard to compare with other countries. So I don't really know how the seasonality plays in Egypt. We may well see that activity picks up again, and then that number will come down quite significantly, quite fast, because they are not that far away from actual natural herd immunity, right? So Egypt will be just a place to watch and see what actually happens. And maybe they haven't started the proper vaccination yet. They've done a few vaccinations, but maybe those were just for testing. But I'm not tracking every country in detail. Maybe next week they will be announcing, oh, we are launching our big national vaccination campaign, right? Possible. And then then it may take up, right? So who knows? So Egypt will just see what happens. And then we have the new normal I already mentioned. So far, they are not really showing any signs of being in any rush to go anywhere. They are just happily in the state of exception and not moving anywhere. And the world as a whole, just about 61% penetrated now. Vaccination 3.7%, not including China, by the way. No, that's not true. The 67% don't include China, but the 3.7% they do include China, because that number came from a source that includes China. I apologize. So it's not strictly comparable. But yeah, China is apparently rolling out fairly speedily, but it's a huge population, right? So it's also not easy. 3.7% sounds low, but remember, globally, only about 15% or less even are really at risk. In many countries where we are not always thinking about them so much, but across Africa, for example, 1.2 billion people in Africa alone, about whom we have basically no data. But one thing we know, they are very useful populations, and there will be a very low IFR in those countries. And therefore, they don't need a lot of vaccinations. They don't actually need to be in this crisis at all. They could just say, look, we ignore it. They could, right? What the individual governments do is a different question, right? Some of them are authoritarian, and they, as I say, authoritarian regimes, they love COVID because they can use it to fortify their positions, right? And they probably do, right? In this kind of thing, they're cleverer than you might think, right? They seize any opportunity to fortify their power, right? But in terms of a health issue, some of these countries barely have a health issue at all, probably. And they can probably do without the vaccines if necessary, but they will, through global initiatives, they will eventually get some vaccines, they will administer them, but it will take time. It's just very hard to know, but 3.7% isn't such a bad number if all of that was applied to people who actually need it. Now, that's not the case, right? We know in many countries, the governments have talked about how they will first vaccinate frontline workers, and they have a very broad definition of frontline workers. Most of them are below 60 years of age, so they don't actually need the vaccination. So meaning those people who actually need it will get it much later than could have been. So there are some countries like that where the vaccinations almost have no impact because they're given to the wrong people. But be that as it may, on the whole, I suspect in most countries, most of the vaccines do end up with those people who need it. And if only 15% or less globally need the vaccine, and nearly 4% already had it, and let's say of the 3.7, let's say 3% were given to the right people, 3 out of, let's say 14 or so, I think is the number globally that really need it. That's not so bad. That's measurable progress. And I think the big progress is yet to come. In the next 6 to 9 months, we will have much more vaccine available from a larger number of suppliers, different types, with different logistics, and more we can just make them accessible just about anybody who wants them. Right? So if unless governments, like the new normal governments, deliberately slow the progression of vaccines, within the next 6 to 9 months, we could have vaccinated anybody who needs it in the world. It's feasible. It's just that governments don't necessarily want it. That will prevent that from happening. But we could do that. Yeah. That's, I think, what the numbers imply. Okay. So, which brings me to remember I had extended scenarios thinking specifically about how the vaccinations might pan out. The vaccinations itself are positive. I mean, their effectiveness is extremely high. Effectiveness in terms of preventing the virus from getting down into the lung, which is the important thing. Very high. Even first shot, already high. So that's all good news. And I think governments, with the US and the UK being sort of the spearhead, demonstrating how effective it is. I mean, it's conceptually, anybody can see, any 5-year-old could understand that it's effective, but apparently most governments first need to see it to believe it, because they're not conceptual thinkers, and you tell them something conceptual, oh, that's conceptual, I don't care, right? So the 5-year-old who can think conceptually already knows that these fatalities in the UK and the US will be coming down, but now we have the statistics to prove it. And I think government people are more inclined to believing in statistics than they are to think conceptually. And so the statistics are maybe more compelling to them than the logic. Okay, they're not philosophers, they're politicians. For the philosopher, of course, it's the opposite, right? Statistics are dubious, but concepts that are logical, they are logical. If they are logical, they are logical. So philosophers and politicians very different in how they think. Yeah, so politicians, they want to see evidence and statistics. Okay, here we start giving you the statistics from the UK and the US. Fatalities are clearly coming down very fast, and everybody's waking up. Oh, You know, in Europe especially, you know, everybody's saying, how come in the UK, they, you know, it's going so well, and how come we don't have those vaccines, right? So the pressure is starting to pile up, at least in those countries where people can assert any pressure on the government, right? So that's all good. So far, so good. Nevertheless, I'm not that optimistic. Let me show you the scenarios. So one scenario, remember I said by December, we could be in early spring if the world just chose to coordinate and roll out the vaccine everywhere where it's really needed to those people who are really at risk. Then we could be done by December. In fact, I just now said 6 to 9 months we could be done. And in fact, I think we could be done in October. Remember in December, I said we could be done by July. Basically, it takes 6 months. If you get your mind around it and you do it, it takes 6 months to get the world covered. In December, I said we could be done in July if people got their head together. Of course, they didn't. So now I'm saying, actually, in my video message to Frau Merkel, I said, you know, if you now push it for Merkel and you get the people together around the table and push it, you could be done by October. In October, Germany has federal elections, so that's an important date for the Germans. And I think, Frau Merkel, this is her last term, and then she will be off the political stage. And, you know, I told her, look, if you want to leave the political stage on a positive note, now is your chance. You have 6 months left in your reign. If you can bang the heads together of the major leaders of the world and say, jointly, we want to get the world liberated. You know, Mr. Biden says, you know, liberation or Independence Day, 4th of July. For the rest of the world, 4th of July is not realistic, but 1st of October, I said to Merkel, would be still possible, just if you really get your head together now and act, right? Now, is that happening? No. Yeah, philosopher speaking, right? Conceptually, you could be done by 1st of October, but no, that's not happening. Now, are we going to be done by December? Even that, not very likely. Why? Because we are just not collaborating globally. And because different governments have such different goals. As I said, the new normal countries, they don't actually want to vaccinate their people. Imagine they had to go back to normal. They hate that idea. They love the new normal, right? So we will never get all the major, and you know, that category probably includes China, even though I'm not having China in my model, you know, in terms of how they behave, China is a new normal country, right? So that's big, right? So you add the others, you have, you know, 1/4 of humanity in that category, right? And they will just not join you. Even if you say, look, we can just jointly decide to just get done with this. And they would say no. They wouldn't participate because they have a different agenda. Yeah. So I'm giving this scenario that by December this year, we would be done, only 20%. Second scenario, by December, we are still exactly where we are now, deep into the fractured world. No change, really. Some countries will be done, they will be through, but because it's only some countries and not others, the borders will still be largely closed, or there will be some bilateral border openings, but nothing that looks like a global, you know, opening. So we will still be very fractured. That's my second scenario, and that's probably 40%. Just to let you know, I love these, tracking these definitions of frontline workers. So some countries, especially new normal countries, are administering the rare vaccines that they have to, you know, the wrong people: postmen, marine workers, transport workers, foreign dorm workers. Now this is lovely. This is in Singapore. You know, remember the foreign dorm workers here, about 300,000 of them. They had very significant activity, and it took the government a long time to realize that. By the time they stepped in and did this massive trace and test everybody and isolate everybody and, you know, terrorize everybody of these workers, by the time they did that, they probably already were near herd immunity. Yeah, I mean, my guess is that, I mean, they live so closely packed together. If the virus is there, you know, then, you know, it will just spread, right? I mean, my guess is that these dorm workers, these 300,000 of them, already are at or near herd immunity. Maybe they have 60, 70% penetration. So now the government is, for a reason that I totally don't understand, prioritizing those workers. First of all, they're all under 60, so there was no fatality. As far as I know, there was not a single fatality among them, 300,000 of them. And you would expect statistically maybe 1% fatality among them. I mean, they're all, healthy workers, on average, probably fairly young or mid-aged. And as far as I know, there was not a single fatality among them. Maybe there was, and I didn't pick it up, but very low fatality anyways. And most of them already were exposed. And now the Singapore government is, of all people, targeting these foreign workers again. A, they would anyways not get sick. B, they already had the virus. So that's like a double waste. More waste than waste. I mean, so these vaccines are completely wasted. Yeah. It's just one example. Right? As you say, I mean, postmen, marine workers, none of these people need the vaccine. Right? Anyway, so there's just wonderful examples of vaccines being squandered, especially in new normal countries. Indonesia at some point said they would only vaccinate people between 18 and 60, and you go, what? Yeah, they are most exposed to the virus. They are more active. Yeah, that's true, but they're also very unlikely to get sick. Yeah. So in Indonesia, they have their vaccination drive, but they're maybe vaccinating the wrong people. So the effect on their herd immunity at that level where it matters will be very low. Anyway, so just some examples, and I probably soon stop tracking this because I think you've got the point. I've been making for a few months now that in some countries systematically the wrong people are being vaccinated, so the vaccines are basically useless in those countries, and there's no progress because of that. Anyway, so 40% likelihood, I think, that we will be exactly where we are today, still in December, so just no change. Then scenario number 3, remember I said if distribution battles, national conflicts break out, they fail to mutually sort of accept the vaccines from other countries, and China now saying you can visit China but only without quarantine, but only if you were vaccinated with our Chinese vaccine, right? So you get this kind of vaccine nationalism. There's still a possibility that there would be conflict within countries because some people are more equal than others. Some people will be disadvantaged, discriminated against. We will see in the summer season in Europe if some people are allowed to travel and others are not because of these vaccine passports or health certificates that they're talking about. Okay, there may still be, civil conflicts arising from this, just because the governments are mishandling, the vaccines, right? And if we have real civil conflict, and mind you, the hardening of the fronts between sort of the back to normal and the new normal countries, if that hardens more and more, we will have a new Cold War. I mean, this all can spill over into a broader political framework where you have China and the West once again confronting each other in a much more rigid way than they did before, including not letting each other's nationals into their country, except not maybe with 2 weeks of quarantine or some such thing, which is de facto prohibits all but the most like diplomatic or maybe media kind of traffic. Some reporters and some diplomats will still travel, and that's about it. Right? So I mean, this could harden the fronts between these blocs that are emerging more and more. So this whole COVID affair could have accelerated the path towards a new Cold War and possibly a third hot war, right, eventually. And on that path, there could be one step could be that by December we are even deeper into the fractured world than we are now, where countries no longer, even collaborate on even accepting each other's measures, including vaccines. Which, and that's a 40% likelihood in my book at the moment. So 20, 40, 40. Yeah. So the early spring, not very likely, unfortunately. And then between either, being in the fractured world or being even deeper into the fractured world, it's sort of equal probability in my book at the moment, right? Now, if we go deeper into the fractured world, that's scenario number 3, that could then, a follow-on scenario on that could take us into the abyss. And that's what I've been saying before. A prolonged separation into nation states or blocks of nation states will precipitate viral diversification, where eventually, if you keep that up long enough, that those different blocks of nations are no longer compatible with each other. Our immune systems are no longer compatible. I know that sounds like a long shot, but if in case scenario 3 does take place, and I give that a 40% chance at the moment, then there is a 10% chance from there that we will go into the abyss. How do I calculate 10%? I don't calculate that, I just make it up, right? So 10% means fairly small, but it's not 0, okay? So there's still 0.4 times 0.1 or whatever probability that we are getting into an abyss scenario where things, even the virus or the COVID becomes worse again, becoming from being insignificant back to becoming severe. Why? Because we will have a multiplicity of non-compatible viruses instead of just having one global virus to deal with, because in some countries the suppression will be so lengthy that IFRs will creep up again. If people are neither exposed to the virus nor to the vaccine for a long period of time, their susceptibility to severe disease goes up with age, right? So their IFR on an individual basis will trend up. And a combination of these factors could yet turn the whole thing that is so benign, I mean, from the virus point of view, it's so benign, and make it into something bad, just because of policy. Okay. So in terms of my dashboard for tracking vaccination progression, percentage of the people in the world who benefit from the vaccine, as I said, less than 1%. That's the number of people who statistically actually get COVID and fall seriously ill with COVID. Percentage of the world at risk and should get the vaccine, I have it at 13%. I don't remember whether I already included the new calculations here around obesity and so on. If not, that would raise that figure a bit. So we are talking about 1 billion people, maybe 1.1 billion people, of which already about 300 million already received that, but these 300 million may not overlap fully, or definitely don't overlap fully with the 1 billion who actually need it, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I already adjusted for that. This is actually 500 million who already got a first jab, of which I'm saying 300 out of that group who actually need it. So about 60%. So of the 1 billion who need it, already almost a third already got it. So that's really good news. However, here's the big catch, and it's got back to the vaccine passports I talked about earlier. The percentage of people who actually benefit from the vaccine is only 1% of the global population. But the percentage of people globally who will have to be vaccinated, funnily enough, maybe several 100%. So not only are the governments saying we want to vaccinate 100% of our populations, but if they want to travel, they may need multiple vaccines from different manufacturers, because in different countries, different vaccines will be required. So if you're someone who wants to travel freely, you may need 3, 4, 5 different vaccines. In addition to that, each vaccine, each double jab may only count for 6 months, because governments may decide to say, oh, we know antibody count goes down after a while. So after 6 months, it's expired and you need a new vaccine. So in any given year, you may need 2 shots, and then over several years, you may need, every 6 months, you need a new shot, and maybe more than one if you need more than one different type. Maybe manufacturers will start pooling them, and one shot will include multiple vaccines, just so that to accommodate those governments. I don't know how that will pan out, but you could imagine that ultimately 300 to 1,000% of humanity, meaning each of us will get vaccinated 3 to 10 times, even though only 1% of us need this vaccination. So this is the most mind-boggling of all the calculations I've made so far, right? If governments insist that you have to be vaccinated again and again and again with a multitude of vaccines just so that you are a free person, we will have an endless vaccination program ahead of us for absolutely no reason, because the virus is harmless, and once you've encountered it once, it can never do any harm to you anymore. But governments just don't see that, and they may impose on us a vaccination regime that is mind-boggling. Now, vaccinations are also harmless, yes, so we will just have to, it's just tedious. It just lowers your appetite for traveling at all, right? It's already tedious enough to need a passport and visa in some countries and security checks, and that's already tedious enough. I don't know why governments are targeting international travelers as their bête noire that they so happily hammer down on. But we are just now opening a new era of hammering down on international travelers. Mark my word. It's going to be so much fun. Okay. We are saying we have declared war on virus, on nature. No. We actually have declared war on our immune systems, because remember, one of the most important things we are doing here is we are preventing people from exposing themselves in a natural way to a natural phenomenon. We are separating ourselves ever more from nature. And I wonder whether, and this is purely for countries with some level of democracy left over, if any, whether we should not enshrine a right for each individual to decide to expose themselves and their immune system. We should have a right to do that. At the moment, that right has been taken away from us. But we individuals must take responsibility for our health. The government is preventing us from living a healthy life. I think that's not only wrong, but that should be illegal. The government should not be able to prevent us from exposing ourselves in a natural way to our natural habitat. We should have a right to do that. And I wonder whether that right should not be enshrined in law, even in the constitution of a country. Now, mind you, if the constitutions just get torn apart by people and trampled upon, then of course it's meaningless anyways, right? This is the optimist in me saying, well, maybe one day we will have our constitutions back. I don't know, but if in some countries at least we get our constitutions back, maybe this belongs into the constitution. We have a right to be healthy. And healthy means healthy immune system. Healthy immune system means you have to train it. Okay, I found this symbol here, the biohazard symbol. It's this funny symbol here, and I found it, like you see it here, was a COVID-19. I saw it on a picture, but I couldn't find that picture anymore. I mean, on a real object somewhere in a door or something. I loved it so much. I got this here from the internet, but unfortunately I couldn't find that picture where this is actually on an actual door or object. Now, first of all, you already know why I love this, because COVID-19 is a disease and not a live agent. The live agent is called SARS-CoV-2. So if you wanted to define SARS-CoV-2 as a biohazard, which is very iffy because it's a harmless common cold virus, as I said, but if you wanted to do that, you should write SARS-CoV-2 onto this and not COVID-19. An illness, a pneumonia, cannot be a live agent. It's two different things. So here again, we have this mixing up of concepts that are very different, right? But what is a live agent is us humans. So I'm proposing that we create a graphic. We humans are the biggest biohazard to this world, and I've said that many times before. I'm proposing that we make that official. The worst biohazard on this planet is human beings. Finally, to my vaccination passport. You know, I love this. You may or may not like this. Maybe you've seen this yellow star before. It says in German, Jew, written in a style, in a font that mimics the Hebrew characters, but it's actually written in German. It says Jew. And as of 1941, in the German Reich, the Third Reich under Hitler, every Jew had to wear this Star of David, this yellow Star of David, openly on their coat or whatever their outer garment, so that anybody at any time could identify them as Jew. They were branded and marked as Jewish people. This was just before they started then to exterminate them completely in all countries that Germany controlled at the time. Right? So the step towards that was to stamp them on the forehead. I'm a Jew, which means I'm homo sacer. I'm outside the law and anybody can kill me at any time. That's essentially what this meant. Right? You are branded as a homo sacer, a person that is no longer protected by any law or moral or any other framework. You are outlawed. Anybody can randomly kill you. The vaccination passport will be like this. Just maybe the reverse. Unless you can produce your vaccination passport, you will be a Jew. If you don't have your vaccination passport on your body at all times, you are an outlaw. You're pariah. And you can be treated with contempt. Maybe people won't kill you, but they will treat you like an animal. That's what the vaccination passports or these health certificates will do. They will be creating two classes of people, visibly. And anybody can ask, show me your vaccination passport. You cannot come into my shop if you don't have a vaccination passport. Imagine that. Then we are very close to putting people back into concentration camps and gassing them. Very, very close. We're getting very close to this. And that's 7.85 billion people this time affected. You either have it or you don't have it. The area of the population that Germany controlled in 1941, by comparison, was much smaller. Only a fraction of humanity was covered by these laws. The vaccination passport may cover all of us. There will be no escape from it. Okay, I promised you that I would share the manifesto that I submitted to Chancellor Merkel about a week ago. Here's the German version. I spent about an hour and a half talking her through this, 10 points. For your benefit, I brought you the English version. Here it is, my translation a bit shortened. 10-point manifesto. I call it the old normal manifesto. Number 1, SARS-CoV-2. This is not new, you know all of this. It's just sort of put together on one page. Number one, SARS-CoV-2 is a common cold coronavirus. Know what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a common cold coronavirus. Second, like all cold viruses, it will be with us forever. It will be endemic to humans, and we will get infected by it again and again and again. Whether we've been immunized for a while naturally, or whether we've been immunized for a while by a vaccine, the effect after 6, 9, 12 months wears off, and we will be susceptible again to be reinfected. Does it matter? No, because we will not get sick. Number three, 99% of human immune systems, even today in the first encounter, have no trouble with this virus. 99% of us, even today, even from the very beginning, had no risk. For us, it's just a common cold if we get infected, or we have no systems at all, we don't even notice. Which also means, in brackets, there's no pandemic, because remember, pandemic is defined as an illness that affects a large proportion of a population. COVID-19 does not affect a large proportion of the population. It affects a very small proportion of the population. Some countries it's more than 1%, yes. Germany now with the IFR that I now calculated, it's maybe 3 to 4%, 4 to 5% even. But that's still a relatively small proportion of the population. It's not a large, and in Africa, it's going to be less than, I don't know, even 0.1%, maybe it's, less than 0.2% or so who are even affected at all, right? So globally, only 1% are at risk of statistically becoming seriously ill. 99% of humanity have an immune system that has no problem coping with this virus. Those 1% who do have a problem, it's for two reasons. One, because the virus is new to them and to everybody, and their immune system is just a bit slow to react to it because it hasn't encountered it before. And secondly, because they're elderly. Plus now I'm saying, okay, plus in some cases because they have overweight or obesity, etc. Right? And some other factors play a role, but primarily because they're old. And the combination of that new and old immune system means immune system doesn't know this virus, and it takes too long to create the right antibodies that prevent the virus from getting into the lung. That's all. That's the whole mechanism that we're dealing with, right? Do understand that mechanism. There's nothing else to this, right? There's just a very simple mechanism. Normally, if we were all young and healthy, then in 100 out of 100 cases, our immune system would prevent the virus from getting into the lung, and we would never have a pneumonia in association with this virus. Unfortunately, because there are quite a lot of people in the world who are aged or have some health problems, in 1% of the cases, that's unfortunately the case, the immune system is too slow and the virus gets into the lung, and there it can make trouble. Number 5, once anyone has encountered the virus once, be it by a natural encounter or by vaccination, they will be immunized for good. They will never have the risk again that the virus gets into their lung. With caveat, if there are very significant variations, then that may not be strictly true. In some cases, then the virus may be so new that some people, even though they had encountered the previous variety, again face a problem with this. So if I say they will never have a problem with this virus again, then that may be a slightly optimistic statement. In some cases they may, but that incidence where a new version is so different and then some people have a problem, the more often we get exposed to these mutants, the better our immune system will be trained to deal with it, right? So that's one reason why I'm saying our current strategy of keeping people away from the virus is wrong. It will have severe long-term effects on our ability to deal. We need to learn as quickly as possible to interact with this virus on a regular basis. And as they mutate, our immune system also changes and adapts. And that's a constant cycle that can totally be below our radar screen. We don't need to think about that. We can just let it happen. It will our immune system will naturally do that. The more we try to intervene with technology and policy, we just screw it up. Number 6, therefore, to control or suppress the virus is not only useless in almost all cases, it's counterproductive, and for especially the reason I just said. It prevents us from familiarizing ourselves with the virus, including all its mutants, right? And that may lead to us being less able to deal, and our personal IFR may go up. And also, as I said, the segmentation or segregation of the world into nation states that work differently and that are blocked off from each other will lead to viral proliferation, which makes everything more complicated. If we then travel, we then encounter a virus that we've never encountered before. In most cases, the immune system, again, 99% of the cases, the immune system will be okay with it, yes. But again, we will have that 1% of people, and that number can only grow in the long run because populations are getting ever older, remember. So we will have a small but growing proportion of the population. Each time they travel to a different country, they face some risk, which is totally unnecessary. If you just open up our borders, that would never happen. If we just let the virus be the same virus everywhere, we wouldn't have that problem. We are just creating that problem for ourselves by closing the borders. And the longer we close the borders, the worse it will become. And then we will need those vaccinations every time we travel to another country. Oh, you don't have this vaccination, you have to have this vaccination. We are creating that complexity. The virus itself doesn't create that complexity at all. If we just allowed our immune system to deal with the virus on a natural basis, it would be all fine. But we're not. We're insisting on imposing ourselves with our science and technology on a natural process that for millions of years has been honed and refined and worked extremely well. In almost all cases, we are now imposing ourselves with our crude science and our crude technology on a process that has been honed over millions of years by evolution. And we think that we know better. And the truth is we absolutely, absolutely do not know better. And we're just making things worse and worse for us for no reason other than our madness, our stupidity. Number 7, the global infection rate for Merkel, I'm just telling you, ex-China is already over 60%. Once the 15% or so, the other page I said 13% of global population at risk have encountered the virus, there is no more crisis. So if we were just to vaccinate those 15% of the global population who have any kind of at-risk indicator, we would be done if we wanted to. And we could just open everything, open all borders, have no restrictions. This could indeed have been achieved by July 2021 if in December we had immediately said that's what we're going to do. It can still, as of today, 1st of April, be achieved by October. And I'm telling you, for Merkel, that could be your final contribution to the world during your government before you step down in October, to do this, to lead this. If we did that on October 1st, the whole world could be ready to return to normal. And there's absolutely no need for anything new normal, no vaccination passports, no health certificates, no border controls, no tests, no quarantines, and none of that, none of that. If we just wanted to go that route, it is so simple. That's what I told Frau Merkel. We'll see what happens. I don't really have high hopes that she is listening to me. She hasn't listened to me for the last 12 months. Since April last year, I've been regularly communicating to her. I have not seen her being responsive in terms of course, I wouldn't necessarily expect a letter back from her, but I would have hoped to see some policies in alignment with what I'm recommending. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. So I don't have high hopes for this scenario that I just sort of laid out. Most likely in December, we will still be in the fractured world just as we are today. And unfortunately, the the fracturing will just harden ever more and more until the point arrives where we no longer have a single humanity on this planet because we are no longer compatible with each other. Our immune systems are no longer compatible with each other. Isn't that funny? What a little cold virus can do, right? Actually, the cold virus doesn't do anything. It's us doing this. So with that, Hegger, skål. And bye.